Some places seem forgotten by the world until they begin watching you, and once you cross their threshold, the boundary between reality and nightmare quietly disappears. That is the unsettling world of The House on the Borderland, written by William Hope Hodgson. Inspired by his years at sea, his fascination with the unknown, and the terrifying possibility that unseen forces exist just beyond human perception, Hodgson crafted a haunting vision unlike anything else of its time. First published in 1908, the novel has captivated readers for generations and continues to sell worldwide, earning its place as one of the defining classics of cosmic and dark fantasy. Hodgson's imagination also gave us unforgettable works, like The Ghost Pirates and The Boats of the Glen Carrig, establishing him as one of the early masters of supernatural horror. While The House on the Borderland has inspired countless filmmakers, writers, and creators, it has never received a major feature film adaptation, adding even more mystery to its enduring legacy. What you are about to experience is a third-person retelling of this remarkable story, not a word-for-word reading of the original. And as you listen, the visuals in this video are created using today's technology. They may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. So settle in, let your imagination wander beyond the edge of the familiar, and the story begins. The west of Ireland held a tiny forgotten hamlet named XIII, crouched at the base of a low hill. Around it, a bleak and inhospitable country stretched for miles, a landscape of bare rock and scattered ruins, where the soil was so thin it barely covered the stone beneath. It was a place that seemed to have been left behind by the world. Despite the desolation, he and his friend Tonneson had chosen it for their vacation. Tonneson had discovered the place by accident the year before, on a walking tour, and had been taken with the fishing in a small unnamed river that ran past the village. The river appeared on no map, and neither did the village itself. The nearest railway station was 40 miles away, which perhaps explained its complete obscurity. They had arrived on a warm evening, exhausted after a full day of jolting over rough tracks in a jaunting car. They had spent the previous night in Ardrahan, and now, with the driver's help, they pitched their tent on a patch of ground near the river. After storing their provisions, they dismissed the driver, arranging for him to return in a fortnight. They had brought everything they needed, including an oil stove, and planned to get water from the stream. Camping had been Tonneson's idea. He had dismissed the notion of lodging in the cottages with a grim humor, describing the overcrowded rooms and the reek of peat smoke that would make a man sneeze until his head ached. While Tonneson busied himself with the stove and bacon, he took the kettle and walked down to the river. On the way he passed a small group of villagers who watched him with curiosity, though none spoke. When he returned, he approached them with a friendly nod, which they returned, and asked about the fishing. They only shook their heads in silence. He tried again, addressing a tall, gaunt man, but received the same response. The man then turned to a companion and spoke rapidly in a language he didn't recognize, and soon the whole group was chattering in what he guessed was Irish. Casting glances his way, the gaunt man finally addressed him, and by his expression, he understood it was a question. He could only shake his head, indicating he didn't understand. The exchange ended when Tonneson called out for the kettle, and he left the group with a smile and a nod which they returned, though puzzlement lingered on their faces. As he walked back to the tent, it was clear the villagers spoke no English, a fact Tonneson confirmed and considered common in such isolated places, where generations lived and died without contact with the outside world. Over their meal he remarked that they should have had the driver interpret for them, and Tonneson grunted in agreement. Later, they discussed their plans, smoked, and secured the tent for the night. He asked Tonneson if he thought the villagers might steal from them, but his friend reassured him, pointing out that they could lock everything valuable in their chest. They settled into their blankets and soon fell asleep. The next morning, they rose early, swam in the river, and had breakfast before overhauling their fishing gear. They then locked up the tent and headed upstream, following the route Tonneson had explored before. They fished happily all day, and by evening they had a fine catch. After cooking some for their supper, they offered the rest to the villagers, who gathered at a respectful distance to watch. The villagers seemed genuinely grateful, and their blessings, though incomprehensible, were clearly heartfelt. The days that followed were pleasant, the fishing was excellent, and the villagers remained friendly, never touching their belongings. It was on a Sunday, a few days after their arrival, that they made a discovery. They had always fished upstream, but on that day they decided to ramble in the opposite direction. They walked leisurely, stopping at midday to eat on a flat rock near the river, and continued on with Tonneson pausing occasionally to sketch the wild scenery. They walked for another hour, until the river they had followed so confidently ended without warning, vanishing into the earth. He stared in amazement, and Tonneson looked equally baffled. His friend suggested they continue on, hoping the river might reappear, and he agreed. They walked another mile, and then Tonneson, scanning the landscape, stopped and pointed, asking if he could see what looked like mist or something over to the right. He strained his eyes and thought he saw something but couldn't be sure. Tonneson decided they should investigate, and he followed his friend. They pushed through bushes and eventually emerged onto a high, boulder-strewn bank. Below them lay a wilderness of tangled trees and shrubs. Tonneson murmured that it felt like they'd stumbled upon an oasis in this desert of stone, his gaze fixed on the wooded lowland below. The narrator followed his friend's stare and saw a great column of hazy spray rising high into the still air from somewhere near the center of the trees, the sunlight catching it and scattering into countless rainbows. He breathed out his admiration, and Tonneson agreed it was beautiful, suggesting there must be a waterfall or something similar, perhaps their vanished river reappearing. They decided to investigate. They made their way down the slope and into the tangled trees and shrubberies. The place was gloomy and oppressive, the bushes matted and the branches overhanging, yet not so dark that the narrator couldn't see that many of the trees were fruit trees, and that there were indistinct signs of long abandoned cultivation. He realized they were moving through the overgrown remains of a great ancient garden, and mentioned this to Tonneson, who agreed it seemed likely. A sense of silent loneliness and desertion grew on the narrator as they pushed forward, a shiver running through him at the thought of what might be lurking in the tangled undergrowth. There was something uncanny in the very air. He suspected Tonneson felt it too, though his friend said nothing. They stopped suddenly. A distant sound had reached them through the trees, a continuous harsh droning roar that seemed to come from far away. The narrator felt a queer, nervous flutter. He looked at Tonneson, seeing only puzzlement on his face, until comprehension crept in, and Tonneson nodded, declaring it was a waterfall. He pushed ahead, and the narrator followed. The roaring grew steadily louder as they moved, until it seemed almost to come from under their feet. Tonneson warned him to watch his step, and then they broke through the trees onto a great open space. Not 6 paces ahead, the ground opened into the mouth of a tremendous chasm, from whose depth the noise rose along with the misty spray they'd seen from the bank. They stood in stunned silence for a minute, then cautiously approached the edge. Peering down through the boiling spray, they saw a monstrous cataract of foaming water burst from the side of the chasm nearly 100 feet below. Tonneson exclaimed in shock, and the narrator felt awed. The sight was grand and unexpectedly eerie, though the true eeriness would sink in more fully later. Looking across the chasm, the narrator saw something towering up through the spray, a fragment of ruin, and touched Tonnesson's shoulder. His friend followed his gaze, and his eyes lit up with excitement. He shouted that they should examine it, feeling there was something strange about the place. They circled the crater-like abyss. As they neared the ruin, the narrator saw it was indeed a portion of some building, but perched not on the chasm's edge, but at the end of a huge spur of rock, jutting out 50 or 60 feet over the abyss, a jagged mass suspended in mid-air. They walked onto the projecting arm of rock, and the narrator felt an intolerable terror, looking down into the unknown depths. with the thunder of falling water and the shroud of spray rising from below. Reaching the ruin, they clambered around it and found a mass of fallen stones. The wall was thick and substantial, but he couldn't imagine what it had been part of, or where the rest of the structure had gone. He left Tonneson rooting through the rubble and went to examine the ground near the chasm's edge, searching for other remnants. He found nothing, growing more puzzled. A cry from Tonneson brought him hurrying back. His friend had dug out a small, crumpled, dilapidated book from the debris and was brushing dirt from it, calling out excitedly. Tonneson handed it to him, telling him to put it in his satchel to protect it from the damp. The narrator flipped through the pages, seeing neat old-fashioned writing, mostly legible but badly damaged in one section, where the pages were muddied and crumpled. He noted the book was surprisingly dry, probably because it had been buried so securely. He tucked it away and helped Tonneson excavate further, but they found only fragments of broken wood. They gave up and returned to solid ground. They made a complete tour of the chasm, observing it was almost a perfect circle, and Tonneson remarked, it was like a gigantic well or pit going sheer down into the earth. They then noticed a clear space to the north and headed toward it, finding a great lake of silent water, except for one spot where it bubbled and gurgled. Away from the waterfall's roar, they could speak normally. The narrator asked Tonneson his thoughts, saying he didn't like the place and wanted to leave. Tonneson nodded, but glanced furtively at the woods. When asked if he'd seen or heard anything, he didn't answer, only stood listening. Then he sharply told him to hark, and they both strained to hear. After a minute of tense silence, the narrator heard nothing, and was about to say so, when a strange wailing floated out of the wood on their left, followed by a rustle of leaves, then silence. Tonneson put a hand on his shoulder and urged they get out of there, heading toward the thinnest part of the trees. The narrator followed, suddenly noticing the sun was low, and the air had grown raw and chilly. They moved through the woods in silence, the narrator glancing nervously around but seeing only trunks and bushes. He had a horrible feeling they were not alone. Staying so close to Tonneson, he kicked his heels twice. They finally emerged onto the bare countryside, and only then did the haunting dread lift. Once, as they walked away, a distant wail seemed to come again, but he told himself it was the wind, though the evening was breathless. Tonneson declared with absolute certainty that he wouldn't spend the night there for anything. There was something unholy, diabolical about the place. The narrator agreed, looking back but seeing nothing, the spot hidden by a rise in the ground. He mentioned the book, his hand going to his satchel, and Tonneson asked with a sudden anxiety if he had it safely. He confirmed that he did. Tonneson suggested they might learn something from the book once they were back at the tent, and urged they hurry. They were still a long way off, and he didn't fancy being caught out there in the dark. They reached the tent 2 hours later, and immediately set about preparing a meal, having eaten nothing since midday. After supper, they cleared away the things and lit their pipes. Tonneson asked him to get the manuscript from his satchel, and when he did, his friend suggested he read it aloud. Tonneson warned him, knowing his habits, not to skip half the book, though had he known what it contained, he would have realized how unnecessary that caution was. And there, seated in the opening of their little tent, he began the strange tale of the house on the borderland. The manuscript's narrator identified himself as an old man, living alone in an ancient house surrounded by overgrown gardens. The peasantry in the wilderness beyond thought him mad, because he kept to himself. He lived only with his old sister, who served as his housekeeper, and he kept no servants. He hated them. He had one friend, his dog, Pepper, whom he valued above all creation. Pepper understood him and knew when to leave him alone during his dark moods. He had decided to start a diary, partly to record thoughts and feelings he couldn't express to anyone, but mainly to make a record of the strange things he'd heard and seen during years of loneliness in the weird old building. The house had a bad reputation stretching back a couple of centuries, and before he bought it, it had stood empty for more than 80 years, which was why he got it so cheaply. He wasn't superstitious, but he had ceased to deny that inexplicable things happened there, and he felt compelled to write them down, though he knew any future readers would likely dismiss him as mad. The house itself was fantastically quaint, with little curved towers and pinnacles that suggested leaping flames, the main body built in a circle. An old story among the country people claimed the devil had built it, but he neither knew nor cared whether that was true. He had lived there some 10 years before witnessing anything that warranted belief in the local stories. He had seen vague, puzzling things on a dozen occasions and felt more than he saw, and as the years passed and he aged, he became often aware of an unseen presence in the empty rooms and corridors, but it was many years before he saw any real manifestation of the supernatural. It was not Halloween, he emphasized. This was a true record, not a tale told for amusement. It was after midnight on the morning of January 21st. He was sitting reading in his study, as was his custom, with Pepper sleeping near his chair. Without warning, the candle flames went low, then shone with a ghastly green effulgence. He looked up quickly and saw the light sink into a dull, ruddy tint, the room glowing with a strange, heavy crimson twilight that doubled the blackness of shadows and made the light look like splashed luminous blood. He heard a faint, frightened whimper on the floor, and something pressed between his feet. Pepper, cowering under his dressing gown. Pepper, usually as brave as a lion. That movement gave him his first real twinge of fear. He had been startled by the green and red lights, but had initially thought it was noxious gas. Now he saw the candles burn steadily, showing no signs of going out, which they would have done if fumes were the cause. He didn't move, feeling distinctly frightened, but unable to think of anything better than to wait. For about a minute, he kept his nervous glance moving around the room. Then he noticed the lights beginning to sink slowly, until they were minute specks of red fire, like rubies gleaming in the darkness. A dreamy indifference stole over him, banishing the fear. At the far end of the room, a faint glow appeared, growing steadily and filling the room with quivering green light, then sinking and changing into a deep, somber crimson that strengthened and lit the room with awful glory. The light came from the end wall and grew brighter, until its glare caused him acute pain, forcing him to close his eyes. When he opened them, the light had decreased. As it grew still duller, he realized he was looking not at the redness but through it, and through the wall beyond. He found himself looking out onto a vast plain, lit with the same gloomy twilight that pervaded the room. The immensity was inconceivable, with no perceivable confines. Details of the nearer portions grew clear, then the light died away, and the vision faded. Suddenly, he was no longer in his chair. He seemed to hover above it, looking down at a dim, huddled, silent something. A cold blast struck him, and he was outside in the night, floating up through the darkness like a bubble, shivering with icy cold. He looked around, and saw only the intolerable blackness pierced by remote gleams of fire. Once he glanced behind and saw the earth as a small crescent of blue light receding, and further off, the sun as a splash of white flame against the dark. After an indefinite period, he saw the earth for the last time a radiant blue globule swimming in eternity. He was a fragile flake of soul dust, flickering across the void from the distant blue into the unknown. A great while passed, and he found himself beyond the fixed stars, plunged into huge blackness. He had felt little beyond lightness and cold discomfort, but now the atrocious darkness crept into his soul, filling him with fear and despair. He wondered what would become of him, where he was going, and then, as the thoughts formed, a faint tinge of blood appeared against the impalpable blackness, remote and mist-like. Immediately, the oppression lightened, and he no longer despaired. The distant redness grew plainer and larger, spreading into a great, somber, dull, tremendous glare. He fled onward, until it stretched beneath him like a great ocean of somber red, interminable in all directions. He descended into a sea of sullen red-hued clouds, emerging to see below him the stupendous plain he had glimpsed from his room, the house that stands upon the borders of the silences. He landed, surrounded by a great waste of loneliness. The place was lit with a gloomy twilight of indescribable desolation. To his right, within the sky, burned a gigantic ring of dull red fire, with huge writhing, jagged flames projecting from its outer edge, its interior black as the outer night. This extraordinary sun provided the doleful light. He glanced down again, seeing nothing but the flat weariness of the interminable plain, no signs of life, no ruins of any habitation. He found himself being borne forward, floating across the flat waste for what seemed an eternity. He felt no great impatience, only some curiosity and vast wonder. He searched always for something to break the monotony, but there was no change, only loneliness, silence, and desert. He noticed, in a half-conscious way, a faint, ruddy mistiness lying over the plain's surface, though when he looked more intently he couldn't quite call it mist. It seemed to blend with the ground, giving everything a peculiar unreality, a sense of unsubstantiality. He began to weary of the sameness, but it was a great while before he perceived any signs of the place toward which he was being carried. At first, he saw it far ahead, like a long hillock on the plain. As he drew nearer, he realized his mistake. It was not a low hill but a chain of great mountains, their distant peaks towering up into the red gloom until almost lost to sight. He came to the mountains, and his journey's course altered, carrying him along their bases until he reached a vast rift opening into them. He was borne through it at no great speed, with huge scarped walls of rock-like substance rising sheer on either side, and far overhead, a thin ribbon of red marking the chasm's mouth among inaccessible peaks. Inside was gloom, deep and somber, and chilly silence. He moved onward steadily until he saw ahead a deep red glow, telling him he was near the gorge's further opening. He emerged from the chasm, staring out upon an enormous amphitheater of mountains, but he recked nothing of the mountains or their terrible grandeur, for he was confounded with amazement to behold, several miles away in the arena's center, a stupendous structure built seemingly of green jade. What astonished him most was not the building itself, but the fact that, save for its color and enormous size, it was identical in every detail to the house in which he lived. He stared fixedly, scarcely believing his eyes, a question reiterating in his mind. What did it mean? What did it mean? He could find no answer, capable only of wonder and fear. He noted fresh points of resemblance that attracted him, until, wearied and sorely puzzled, he turned from the structure to view the rest of the strange place. The arena appeared a perfect circle, 10 to 12 miles in diameter, with a house standing at its center. The surface had that same peculiar misty appearance that was yet not mist. He glanced upward along the slopes of the circling mountains, struck by their abominable stillness. It was more trying than anything he had yet seen or imagined. Up there, the impalpable redness blurred everything. Then a new terror came to him. Among the dim peaks to his right, he descried a vast, giant-like shape of blackness growing on his sight. It had an enormous equine head with gigantic ears, peering steadfastly down into the arena, its pose suggesting eternal watchfulness, as though it had warded that dismal place through unknown eternities. His gaze sprang from it to something further off, and higher, something black with 4 grotesque arms. Features showed indistinctly, and around its neck he made out several light-colored objects that he realized coldly were skulls. A memory slid into his mind. He was looking at a monstrous representation of Kali, the Hindu goddess of death. Other remembrances drifted back. His glance fell again upon the huge beast-headed thing, and he recognized it as the ancient Egyptian god Set, the destroyer of souls. A great sweep of questioning rose in him. He stopped, trying to think, things beyond imagination peering into his frightened mind. The old gods of mythology. He tried to comprehend what it all pointed to, his gaze flickering between the two. An idea came swiftly, and he glanced rapidly upward, searching the gloomy crags to his left. Under a great peak, a shape of grayness loomed a tremendous head, but no eyes. That part of its face was blank. He saw others among the mountains, further off, reclining on a lofty ledge, a livid, irregular, ghoulish mass, with an unclean half-animal face looking out from somewhere about its middle. There were hundreds of them, seeming to grow out of the shadows. Several he recognized as mythological deities. Others were utterly strange, beyond human conception. The mountains were full of beast gods and horrors so atrocious that decency denied any further attempt to describe them. He was filled with overwhelming horror and repugnance, yet even so he wondered, was there, after all, something more to the old heathen worship than mere deifying? The thought gripped him. He questioned again what these beast gods and others were. At first, they had seemed like sculptured monsters placed indiscriminately among the peaks, but as he scrutinized them more intently, he sensed something about them, an indescribable silent vitality, suggesting a state of life and death, not life as he understood it, but an inhuman form of existence, a deathless trance, a condition in which they might continue eternally. The word immortal rose unbidden, and he wondered if this might be the immortality of the gods. Then something happened. Until then, he had stayed just within the shadow of the rift's exit. Now, without volition, he drifted out into the semi-darkness and began to move slowly across the arena toward the house. He gave up all thought of the prodigious shapes above and could only stare, frightened, at the tremendous structure toward which he was being remorselessly conveyed. He searched earnestly, but discovered nothing new, and gradually became calmer. He reached a point more than halfway between the house and the gorge, surrounded by stark loneliness and unbroken silence, still nearing the great building. Then something caught his vision, a gigantic thing that came around one of the house's huge buttresses into full view. It moved with a curious lope, going almost upright like a man, unclothed and with a remarkable luminous appearance. But it was the face that attracted and frightened him most, the face of a swine. He watched this horrible creature intently, momentarily forgetting his fear and his interest in its movements. It made its way cumbrously around the building, stopping at each window to peer in and shake the bars protected just as in his own house, and at each door, pushing and fingering the fastening stealthily, evidently searching for an ingress. He had come within less than a quarter-mile of the great structure, still compelled forward, when the thing turned and gazed hideously in his direction. It opened its mouth, and for the first time, the stillness was broken by a deep, booming note that sent an added thrill of apprehension through him. Then it was coming toward him, swiftly and silently, covering half the distance in an instant. He was still borne helplessly to meet it. Only 100 yards, and the brutish ferocity of the giant face numbed him with unmitigated horror. He could have screamed in the supremacy of his fear, and then, in the very moment of extremity and despair, he became conscious that he was looking down upon the arena from a rapidly increasing height. He was rising. In an inconceivably short while, he had reached an altitude of many hundred feet. Beneath him, the spot he had just left was occupied by the foul swine creature, now down on all fours, snuffing and rooting like a veritable hog at the arena's surface. A moment, and it rose to its feet, clutching upward with an expression of desire such as he had never seen in this world. He mounted higher. A few minutes, it seemed, and he had risen above the great mountains, floating alone in the redness. At a tremendous distance below, the arena showed dimly, the mighty house looking no larger than a tiny spot of green. The swine thing was no longer visible. He passed over the mountains, out above the plain's huge breadth. Far away on its surface, in the direction of the ring-shaped sun, a confused blur showed. He looked toward it indifferently, reminded somewhat of his first glimpse of the mountain amphitheater. He glanced upward at the immense ring of fire with a sense of weariness, struck by its strangeness. As he stared, a sudden flare of extraordinarily vivid fire spurted from the dark center. Compared to the black mass it was nothing, yet in itself stupendous. He watched with awakened interest, noting its strange boiling and glowing, and then, in a moment, the whole thing grew dim and unreal, and passed out of sight. Much amazed, he glanced down to the plain from which he was still rising, and received a fresh surprise. Everything had vanished, and only a sea of red mist spread far below him. As he stared, it grew remote, and died away into a dim, far mystery of red against an unfathomable night. A while, and even this was gone, and he was wrapped in an impalpable, lightless gloom. He was left with only the memory that he had lived through such darkness once before, and that sustained his thoughts. A great time passed ages. Then a single star broke through the darkness, the first of one of the outlying clusters of this universe. Presently it was far behind, and all about him shone the splendor of countless stars. Later, years it seemed, he saw the sun, a clot of flame, and around it several remote specks of light, the planets of the solar system. And so he saw the earth again, blue and unbelievably minute, growing larger and becoming defined. A long space of time came and went, and then at last he entered into the shadow of the world, plunging headlong into the dim and holy earth night. Overhead were the old constellations and a crescent moon. As he neared the earth's surface, a dimness swept over him, and he seemed to sink into a black mist. For a while he knew nothing. He was unconscious. Gradually, he became aware of a faint, distant whining that grew plainer. A desperate feeling of agony possessed him. He struggled madly for breath and tried to shout. A moment, and he got his breath more easily. He was conscious that something was licking his hand, and something damp swept across his face. He heard panting, and then again the whining, coming to his ears with a sense of familiarity, and he opened his eyes. All was dark, but the oppression had left him. He was seated, and something was whining piteously and licking him. He felt strangely confused, instinctively trying to ward off the thing that licked. His head was curiously vacant, and for the moment he seemed incapable of action or thought. Then things came back to him, and he called, "Pepper," faintly answered by a joyful bark and renewed frantic caresses. In a little while he felt stronger, and put out his hand for matches. He groped blindly for a few moments until his hands found them. He struck a light and looked confusedly around, seeing the old familiar things. He sat full of dazed wonders until the match flame burnt his finger, and he dropped it with a hasty expression of pain and anger that surprised him with the sound of his own voice. He struck another match and stumbled across the room to light the candles, observing they had not burned away but had been put out. As the flame shot up, he turned and stared about the study, finding nothing unusual, and a gust of irritation took him. He held his head with both hands, trying to remember. The great silent plain, the ring-shaped sun of red fire. Where were they? Where had he seen them? How long ago? He felt dazed and muddled, walking up and down unsteadily. His memory dulled, the things he had witnessed coming back to him with an effort. He remembered cursing peevishly in his bewilderment. Then he turned faint and giddy, grasping at the table for support, holding on weakly for a few moments before tottering sideways into a chair. After a little time, he felt somewhat better and reached the cupboard where he kept brandy and biscuits. He poured himself a little stimulant and drank it off, then took a handful of biscuits and returned to his chair, devouring them ravenously. Vaguely surprised at his hunger, he felt as though he had eaten nothing for an uncountably long while. As he ate, his glance roved about the room, searching almost unconsciously for something tangible among the invisible mysteries that encompassed him. He thought there must be something, and in the same instant his gaze dwelt upon the clock face in the opposite corner. He stopped eating, and just stared. Though its ticking indicated it was still going, the hands pointed to a little before midnight, whereas he knew it was considerably after that time when he had witnessed the strange happenings. For a moment, he was astounded and puzzled. Had the hour been the same as when he had last seen the clock, he would have concluded the hands had stuck while the mechanism went on, but that wouldn't account for the hands having traveled backward. Then the thought flashed upon him that it was now close upon the morning of the 22nd, and that he had been unconscious to the visible world through the greater portion of the last 24 hours. The thought occupied his attention for a full minute, then he commenced to eat again, still very hungry. During breakfast the next morning, he casually asked his sister about the date, and found his surmise correct. He had indeed been absent in spirit for nearly a day and a night. She asked no questions, as it was not the first time he had kept to his study for a whole day, or sometimes a couple, when engrossed in his books or work. And so the days passed, and he was still filled with wonder to know the meaning of all he had seen on that memorable night, though he knew his curiosity was little likely to be satisfied. The house was surrounded by a huge estate of wild, uncultivated gardens. Away at the back, some 300 yards distant, was a dark, deep ravine called the Pit by the peasantry, with a sluggish stream at the bottom so overhung by trees it was scarcely visible from above. This river had a subterranean origin, emerging suddenly at the ravine's east end and disappearing as abruptly beneath the cliffs at its western extremity. Some months after his vision of the Great Plain, his attention was particularly attracted to the pit. One day, while walking along its southern edge, several pieces of rock and shale were dislodged from the cliff beneath him, falling with a sullen crash through the trees and splashing into the river below. He would have given the incident only passing thought had Pepper not immediately begun to bark savagely, refusing to be silent even when he commanded most unusual behavior. Feeling there must be someone or something in the pit, he went back to the house quickly for a stick. When he returned, Pepper had ceased barking and was growling and smelling uneasily along the top. He whistled to the dog to follow, and started to descend cautiously. The depth to the bottom was about 150 feet, and some time and considerable care were expended before they reached it safely. Once down, they explored along the riverbanks, the darkness profound, due to overhanging trees. He moved warily, keeping his glance about and his stick ready. Pepper was quiet now and stayed close. They searched up one side without hearing or seeing anything, then crossed over by jumping and began beating their way back through the underbrush. They had accomplished perhaps half the distance when he heard again the sound of falling stones on the other side. A large rock came thundering through the treetops, struck the opposite bank, and bounded into the river, driving a great jet of water over them. Pepper gave a deep growl, then stopped and pricked up his ears. He listened as well. A second later, a loud, half-human, half-pig-like squeal sounded from among the trees, apparently about halfway up the south cliff, answered by a similar note from the bottom. Pepper gave a short, sharp bark and sprang across the little river, disappearing into the bushes. Immediately afterward, he heard his dog's barks increase in depth and number, with a noise of confused jabbering in between. This ceased, and in the succeeding silence there rose a semi-human yell of agony. Almost immediately, Pepper gave a long-drawn howl of pain, and then the shrubs were violently agitated as he came running out with his tail down, glancing over his shoulder. As he reached him, the narrator saw he was bleeding from what appeared to be a great claw wound in the side that had almost laid bare his ribs. Seeing Pepper so mutilated, a furious anger seized him. Whirling his staff, he sprang across into the bushes from which Pepper had emerged. As he forced his way through, he thought he heard a sound of breathing. Next instant he burst into a little clear space, just in time to see something, livid white in color, disappear among the bushes on the opposite side. He ran toward it with a shout, but though he struck and probed among the bushes with his stick, he neither saw nor heard anything further. He returned to Pepper, bathed his wound in the river, and bound his wetted handkerchief around his body. Then they retreated up the ravine and into the daylight again. On reaching the house, his sister asked what had happened to Pepper, and he told her he had been fighting with a wildcat, of which he had heard there were several about. He decided it was better not to tell his sister how it had really happened, though he scarcely knew himself, but he did know that the thing he had seen run into the bushes was no wildcat. It was much too big, with a skin like a hog's, only of a dead, unhealthy white color, and it had run upright or nearly so on its hind feet, with a motion resembling that of a human being. That much he had noticed in his brief glimpse, and he felt a good deal of uneasiness besides curiosity as he turned the matter over in his mind. The incident had occurred in the morning. Then after dinner, as he sat reading, he happened to look up suddenly and saw something peering in over the window ledge, only the eyes and ears showing. He rose to his feet, saying it was a pig, and saw the thing more completely. But it was no pig. God alone knew what it was. It reminded him vaguely of the hideous thing that had haunted the great arena. It had a grotesquely human mouth and jaw, but no chin to speak of, the nose prolonged into a snout, with little eyes and queer ears that gave it an extraordinarily swine-like appearance. There was little forehead, and the whole face was of an unwholesome white color. He stood looking at it for perhaps a minute with growing disgust and some fear. The mouth kept jabbering inanely, once emitting a half-swinish grunt. It was the eyes that attracted him most. They seemed to glow at times with a horribly human intelligence, flickering away from his face over the room's details, as though his stare disturbed it. It supported itself by two claw-like hands upon the windowsill, of a clayey brown hue, with an indistinct resemblance to human hands' 4 fingers and a thumb, webbed up to the first joint like a duck's, with nails so long and powerful they were more like eagle's talons. He felt fear, though almost of an impersonal kind, more a sensation of abhorrence, as though brought in contact with something superhumanly foul, something unholy, belonging to some undreamt-of state of existence. He couldn't say he grasped these details at the time. They seemed to come back afterward, as though imprinted on his brain. He imagined more than he saw, and the material details grew upon him later. After perhaps a minute of staring, his nerves steadied, and he shook off the vague alarm, taking a step toward the window. The thing ducked and vanished. He rushed to the door and looked around hurriedly, but only the tangled bushes and shrubs met his gaze. He ran back into the house, got his gun, and sallied out to search through the gardens. He wondered whether this was the same creature he had glimpsed in the morning, and inclined to think it was. He would have taken pepper, but judged it better to give his wound a chance to heal. Besides, if the creature was his antagonist of the morning, it was unlikely he would be of much use. He began his search systematically, determined to find and put an end to that swine thing. This was at least a material horror. At first he searched cautiously, mindful of Pepper's wound, but as the hours passed, and no sign of anything living showed in the great lonely gardens, he became less apprehensive, almost as though he would welcome the sight of it. Anything seemed better than the silence, with the ever-present feeling that the creature might be lurking in every bush. Later, he grew careless of danger, plunging right through the bushes and probing with his gun barrel. He shouted at times, but only the echoes answered back. He thought to frighten or stir the creature into showing itself, but only succeeded in bringing his sister Mary out to ask what was the matter. He told her he had seen the wildcat that had wounded Pepper, and was trying to hunt it out. She seemed only half satisfied and went back into the house with an expression of doubt. He wondered whether she had seen or guessed anything. He prosecuted the search anxiously for the rest of the afternoon, feeling he would be unable to sleep with that bestial thing haunting the shrubberies. Yet when evening fell, he had seen nothing. Then, as he turned homeward, he heard a short, unintelligible noise among the bushes to his right. He turned instantly, aimed quickly, and fired in the direction of the sound. Immediately afterward, he heard something scuttling away among the bushes, moving rapidly until it went out of hearing. After a few steps, he ceased his pursuit, realizing how futile it would be in the fast-gathering gloom, and with a curious feeling of depression entered the house. That night, after his sister had gone to bed, he went around to all the windows and doors on the ground floor, and saw that they were securely fastened. The precaution was scarcely necessary, for the windows all on the lower story were strongly barred, but for the 5 doors, not one of which was locked, it was wisely thought. Having secured them, he went to his study, but for once the place jarred upon him. It seemed so huge and echoey. He tried to read for some time, but finding it impossible, he carried his book down to the kitchen, where a large fire was burning, and sat there. He had read for a couple of hours, when he heard a sound that made him lower his book and listen intently, something rubbing and fumbling against the back door. Once the door creaked loudly, as though force were being applied. During those few short moments, he experienced an indescribable terror, such as he would have believed impossible. His hands shook, cold sweat broke out on him, and he shivered violently. Gradually, he calmed. The stealthy movements outside had ceased. For an hour he sat silent and watchful. Then the fear took him again, as he imagined an animal must feel under the eye of a snake, yet he could hear nothing. Still, there was no doubting that some unexplained influence was at work. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, something stole on his ear, a sound that resolved into a faint murmur, quickly developing into a muffled but hideous chorus of bestial shrieks, appearing to rise from the bowels of the earth. He heard a thud and realized in a dull, half-comprehending way that he had dropped his book. After that, he just sat, and thus the daylight found him, creeping wanly in through the barred high windows of the great kitchen. With the dawning light, the stupor and fear left him, and he came more into possession of his senses. He picked up his book and crept to the door to listen. Not a sound broke the chilly silence. For some minutes he stood there, then very gradually and cautiously drew back the bolt and opened the door to peep out. His caution was unneeded. Nothing was to be seen, save the gray vista of dreary tangled bushes and trees extending to the distant plantation. With a shiver, he closed the door and made his way quietly up to bed. It was evening a week later. His sister sat in the garden knitting while he walked up and down reading, his gun leaning against the wall. Since the strange thing's advent, he had deemed it wise to take precautions. Yet through the whole week, there had been nothing to alarm him by sight or sound, so he was able to look back calmly at the incident, though still with unmitigated wonder and curiosity. He was somewhat engrossed in his book when he heard a crash away in the direction of the pit. With a quick movement, he turned and saw a tremendous column of dust rising high into the evening air. His sister rose with a sharp exclamation of surprise and fright. He told her to stay where she was, snatched up his gun, and ran toward the pit. As he neared it, he heard a dull rumbling sound that grew quickly into a roar, split with deeper crashes, and up from the pit drove a fresh volume of dust. The noise ceased, though the dust still rose tumultuously. He reached the edge and looked down, but could see nothing save a boil of dust clouds swirling hither and thither. The air was so full of particles it blinded and choked him, and he finally had to run out from the smother to breathe. Gradually, the suspended matter sank and hung in a panoply over the pit's mouth. He could only guess at what had happened. That there had been a landslip of some kind, he had little doubt, but the cause was beyond his knowledge. Yet even then, he had half imaginings the thought had come to him of those falling rocks and that thing in the bottom of the pit, but in the first minutes of confusion, he failed to reach the natural conclusion to which the catastrophe pointed. Slowly the dust subsided, until he was able to approach the edge and look down. He peered impotently through the reek, trying to see. At first it was impossible to make out anything, but as he stared he saw something below to his left that moved. He looked intently, and made out another, and then another 3 dim shapes climbing up the side of the pit, visible only indistinctly. Even as he stared and wondered, he heard a rattle of stones somewhere to his right. He glanced across but could see nothing. He leaned forward, peering over and down into the pit just beneath where he stood, and saw no further than a hideous white swine face that had risen to within a couple of yards of his feet. Below it, he could make out several others. As the thing saw him, it gave a sudden uncouth squeal, answered from all parts of the pit. A gust of horror and fear took him, and bending down, he discharged his gun right into its face. The creature disappeared with a clatter of loose earth and stones. There was a momentary silence, to which he probably owed his life during it. He heard a quick patter of many feet, and turning sharply, saw a troop of the creatures coming toward him at a run. He raised his gun and fired at the foremost, who plunged headlong with hideous howling. Then he turned to run. More than halfway from the house to the pit, he saw his sister coming toward him. He couldn't see her face distinctly in the dusk, but there was fear in her voice as she called to know why he was shooting. He shouted for her to run for her life. Without more ado, she turned and fled, picking up her skirts with both hands. As he followed, he glanced behind. The brutes were running on their hind legs, at times dropping on all fours. It must have been the terror in his voice that spurred Mary to run so. He felt convinced she had not yet seen those hell creatures that pursued. On they went, his sister leading. Each moment, the nearing sounds of footsteps told him the brutes were gaining rapidly. Fortunately, he was accustomed to an active life, but the strain of the race was beginning to tell severely on him. Ahead, he could see the back door. Luckily it was open. He was some half-dozen yards behind Mary now, his breath sobbing in his throat. Then something touched his shoulder. He wrenched his head around quickly and saw one of those monstrous, pallid faces close to his one of the creatures, having outrun its companions, had almost overtaken him. Even as he turned, it made a fresh grab. With a sudden effort, he sprang to one side and, swinging his gun by the barrel, brought it crashing down upon the foul creature's head. The thing dropped with an almost human groan. Even this short delay had nearly brought the rest of the brutes down upon him. Without an instant's waste of time, he turned and ran for the door. Reaching it, he burst into the passage, then turned quickly, slamming and bolting the door just as the first creature rushed against it with a sudden shock. His sister sat gasping in a chair, seeming in a fainting condition, but he had no time then to spend on her. He had to make sure all the doors were fastened. Fortunately, they were. The one leading from his study into the gardens was the last he checked. He had just noted it was secured when he thought he heard a noise outside. He stood perfectly silent and listened. Yes, now he could distinctly hear whispering, and something slithered over the panels with a rasping, scratchy noise. Evidently some of the brutes were feeling with their claw hands about the door, discovering whether there were any means of ingress. That the creatures should so soon have found the door was proof of their reasoning capabilities. It assured him they must not be regarded as mere animals. He had felt something of this before, when that first thing peered through his window. Then he had applied the term superhuman to it, with an almost instinctive knowledge that the creature was something different from the brute beast, something beyond human, yet in no good sense, but rather something foul and hostile to the great and good in humanity. Intelligent, and yet inhuman. The very thought filled him with revulsion. He bethought him of his sister, went to the cupboard, and got out brandy and a wine-glass. Taking these and a lighted candle, he went down to the kitchen. She was not in the chair but had fallen out, lying face downward on the floor. Very gently he turned her over and raised her head somewhat, pouring a little brandy between her lips. After a while, she shivered slightly. A little later, she gave several gasps, and opened her eyes, looking at him in a dreamy, unrealizing way. Her eyes closed slowly, and he gave her a little more brandy. For perhaps a minute longer she lay silent, breathing quickly. All at once, her eyes opened again, and as he looked, he saw the pupils were dilated, as though fear had come with returning consciousness. Then with a movement so unexpected he started backward. She sat up. Noticing she seemed giddy, he put out his hand to steady her. At that, she gave a loud scream, and scrambling to her feet ran from the room. For a moment he stayed there, kneeling and holding the brandy flask, utterly puzzled and astonished. Could she be afraid of him? But no, why should she? He could only conclude her nerves were badly shaken, that she was temporarily unhinged. Upstairs, he heard a door bang loudly and knew she had taken refuge in her room. He put the flask down on the table. His attention was distracted by a noise in the direction of the back door. He went toward it and listened. It appeared to be shaken, as though some of the creatures struggled with it silently, but it was far too strongly constructed and hung to be easily moved. Out in the gardens rose a continuous sound. It might have been mistaken by a casual listener for the grunting and squealing of a herd of pigs, but as he stood there, it came to him that there was sense and meaning to those swinish noises. Gradually, he seemed able to trace a semblance to human speech, glutinous and sticky, as though each articulation were made with difficulty, yet he was becoming convinced it was no mere medley of sounds, but a rapid interchange of ideas. By this time it had grown quite dark in the passages, and from them came all the varied cries and groans of which an old house is so full after nightfall. It seemed to him that each crack and creak was the coming of one of those things along the dark corridors, though he knew in his heart this could not be, for he had seen all the doors were secure. Gradually, these sounds grew on his nerves to such an extent that, were it only to punish his cowardice, he felt he must make the round of the basement again, and, if anything were there, face it. Then he would go up to his study, for he knew sleep was out of the question with the house surrounded by creatures half beasts, half something else, and entirely unholy. Taking the kitchen lamp down from its hook, he made his way from cellar to cellar, room to room, through pantry and coal hole, along passages, and into the 101 little blind alleys and hidden nooks that formed the basement. When he knew he had been in every corner and cranny large enough to conceal aught of any size, he made his way to the stairs. With his foot on the first step, he paused. He seemed to hear a movement from the buttery to the left of the staircase. It had been one of the first places he searched, yet he felt certain his ears had not deceived him. His nerves were strung now, and with hardly any hesitation, he stepped up to the door, holding the lamp above his head. In a glance, he saw the place was empty save for the heavy stone slab supported by brick pillars, and he was about to leave it, convinced he had been mistaken, when in turning, his light was flashed back from two bright spots outside the window, high up. He stood there staring for a few moments, then they moved, revolving slowly, throwing out alternate scintillations of green and red. He knew then that they were eyes. He traced the shadowy outline of one of the things against the window, holding onto the bars, its attitude suggesting climbing. He went nearer and held the light higher. There was no need to be afraid the bars were strong, but suddenly, despite knowing the brute couldn't reach him, he had a return of that horrible sensation of fear from a week earlier. The same helpless, shuddering fright. He realized dimly that the creature's eyes were looking into his with a steady, compelling stare. He tried to turn away but couldn't. He seemed to see the window through a mist. Then other eyes came and peered, and yet others, until a whole galaxy of malignant staring orbs held him in thrall. His head began to swim and throb violently. Then he became aware of acute physical pain in his left hand. It grew more severe, forcing his attention. With a tremendous effort, he glanced down, and the spell broke. He realized he had, in his agitation, unconsciously caught hold of the hot lamp glass and burned his hand badly. He looked up to the window again. The misty appearance had gone, and now he saw it crowded with dozens of bestial faces. With a sudden access of rage, he raised the lamp and hurled it full at the window. It struck the glass, smashing a pane, and passed between two bars out into the garden, scattering burning oil. He heard several loud cries of pain, and as his sight became accustomed to the dark, he discovered the creatures had left the window. Pulling himself together, he groped for the door and made his way upstairs, stumbling at each step. He felt dazed, as though he had received a blow to the head. His hand smarted badly, and he was full of a nervous, dull rage against those things. Reaching his study, he lit the candles. As they burned up, their rays were reflected from the rack of firearms on the side wall. At the sight, he remembered he had a power there that seemed as fatal to those monsters as to ordinary animals, and he determined to take the offensive. First, he bound up his hand, the pain fast becoming intolerable. After that, it seemed easier, and he crossed to the rifle stand, selecting a heavy rifle, an old and tried weapon. Having procured ammunition, he made his way up into one of the small towers that crowned the house. From there, he could see nothing. The gardens presented a dim blur of shadows, a little blacker where the trees stood. He knew it was useless to shoot down into all that darkness. The only thing to do was wait for the moon to rise, then he might be able to do some execution. He sat still, keeping his ears open. The gardens were comparatively quiet now, only an occasional grunt or squeal coming up. He didn't like the silence. It made him wonder what devilry the creatures were bent on. Twice he left the tower and walked through the house, but everything was silent. Once, he heard a noise from the direction of the pit, as though more earth had fallen, followed by a commotion among the garden's denizens that lasted some 15 minutes before dying away. About an hour later, the moon's light showed above the distant horizon. From where he sat, he could see it over the trees, but it wasn't until it rose clear of them that he could make out details in the gardens below. Even then, he could see none of the brutes until, happening to crane forward, he saw several lying prone against the house wall. He couldn't make out what they were doing, but the chance was too good to ignore. Taking aim, he fired at the one directly beneath. A shrill scream rose, and as the smoke cleared, he saw it had turned on its back and was writhing feebly before going quiet. The others had disappeared. Immediately after, he heard a loud squeal from the direction of the pit, answered 100 times from every part of the garden. This gave him some notion of their numbers, and he began to feel the affair was becoming even more serious than he had imagined. As he sat watchful, the thought came, why was all this? What were these things? What did it mean? His thoughts flew back to that vision of the plane of silence, that thing in the arena, and lastly the house he had seen in that faraway place, so like this in every external detail that it might have been modeled from it, or this from that. He had never thought of that. Another long squeal came from the pit, followed by a couple of shorter ones. The garden filled with answering cries. He stood quickly and looked over the parapet. In the moonlight, the shrubbery seemed alive, tossing hither and thither as though shaken by a strong, irregular wind, with continuous rustling and scampering feet rising to him. Several times he saw moonlight gleam on running white figures among the bushes, and twice he fired. The second shot was answered by a short squeal of pain. A minute later, the gardens lay silent. From the pit came a deep, hoarse babble of swine talk, at times angry cries that were answered by multitudinous gruntings. It occurred to him they were holding some kind of council, perhaps to discuss entering the house. Also, they seemed much enraged, probably by his successful shots. He decided now would be a good time for a final survey of their defenses. He visited the whole basement again, examining each door. Luckily, they were all like the back one, solid, iron-studded oak. Then he went upstairs to the study. He was more anxious about this door. It was palpably of a more modern make than the others, and, though stout, had little of their ponderous strength. There was a small raised lawn on this side of the house upon which this door opened, the study windows barred on this account. All the other entrances, except the great gateway which was never opened, were in the lower story. He spent some time puzzling how to strengthen the study door. Finally, he went down to the kitchen and, with some trouble, brought up several heavy pieces of timber. He wedged them slantwise against the door from the floor, nailing them top and bottom. For half an hour he worked hard, and at last got it shored to his satisfaction. Feeling easier, he resumed his coat and attended to one or two matters before returning to the tower. While thus employed, he heard fumbling at the door and the latch tried. He kept silence and waited. Soon he heard several creatures outside, grunting softly to one another. Then a minute of quiet. Suddenly, a quick, low grunt sounded, and the door creaked under tremendous pressure. It would have burst inward but for the supports. The strain ceased as quickly as it had begun, and there was more talk. One of the things squealed softly, and he heard others approaching. A short confabulation, then silence. He realized they had called more to assist. Feeling this was the supreme moment, he stood ready with his rifle presented. If the door gave, he would at least slay as many as possible. Again came the low signal, and once more the door cracked under huge force. For perhaps a minute the pressure was kept up, and he waited nervously, expecting each moment to see it come down with a crash. But the struts held, and the attempt proved abortive. More horrible grunting talk followed, and he thought he distinguished fresh arrivals. After a long discussion, during which the door was several times shaken, they quieted once more, and he knew they were going to make a third attempt. He was almost in despair. The props had been severely tried in the two previous attacks, and he was sorely afraid this would prove too much. Then, like an inspiration, a thought flashed into his troubled brain. Instantly, he ran from the room and up stair after stair, not to one of the towers, but out onto the flat leaded roof. Once there, he raced across to the parapet and looked down. As he did so, he heard the short grunted signal, and even up there caught the crying of the door under assault. There was not a moment to lose. Leaning over, he aimed quickly and fired. The report rang sharply, and almost blending with it came the loud smack of the bullet striking its mark. From below rose a shrill wail, and the door ceased its groaning. Then, as he took his weight from the parapet, a huge piece of stone coping slid from under him and fell with a crash among the disorganized throng beneath. Several horrible shrieks quavered through the night air, then he heard scampering feet. Cautiously, he looked over. In the moonlight, he could see the great coping stone lying right across the threshold of the door. He thought he saw something under it. Several things, white, but he couldn't be sure. A few minutes passed. As he stared, he saw something come around out of the shadow of the house. One of the things. It went up to the stone silently and bent down. He couldn't see what it did. In a minute it stood up, something in its talons that it put to its mouth and tore at. For a moment, he didn't realize what he was seeing. Then slowly he comprehended. The thing was stooping again. It was horrible. He started to load his rifle. When he looked again, the monster was tugging at the stone, moving it to one side. He leaned the rifle on the coping and pulled the trigger. The brute collapsed on its face and kicked slightly. Almost simultaneously with the report, he heard another sound breaking glass. Waiting only to reload, he ran from the roof and down the first 2 flights of stairs. There he paused to listen. Another tinkle of falling glass came, appearing to be from the floor below. Excitedly, he sprang down the steps, guided by the rattle of the window sash, and reached the door of one of the empty bedrooms at the back of the house. He thrust it open. The room was dimly illuminated by moonlight, most of the light blotted out by moving figures at the window. Even as he stood, one crawled through into the room. Leveling his weapon, he fired point blank at it, filling the room with a deafening bang. When the smoke cleared, the room was empty and the window free. The room was much lighter now, night air blowing in coldly through shattered panes. Below, he could hear soft moaning and a confused murmur of swine voices. Stepping to one side of the window, he reloaded and stood waiting. Presently, he heard scuffling. From where he stood in the shadow, he could see without being seen. The sounds came nearer, and then he saw something come up above the sill and clutch at the broken window frame, catching a piece of woodwork. He could make out that it was a hand and arm. A moment later, the face of one of the swine creatures rose into view. Then, before he could use his rifle, there came a sharp crack, and the window frame gave way under the thing's weight. Next instant, a squashing thud and a loud outcry told him it had fallen to the ground. With a savage hope that it had been killed, he went to the window. The moon had gone behind a cloud, so he could see nothing, though a steady hum of jabbering just beneath where he stood indicated several more brutes close at hand. As he stood looking down, he marveled how the creatures had climbed so far. The wall was comparatively smooth, the distance to the ground at least 80 feet. Then, as he bent peering, he saw something indistinctly, a black line cutting the gray shadow of the house side, passing the window to the left at about 2 feet. He remembered it was a gutter pipe put there years ago to carry off rainwater, and he had forgotten it. He could see now how they had managed to reach the window. Even as the solution came, he heard a faint slithering, scratching noise, and knew another brute was coming. He waited some moments, then leaned out and felt the pipe. To his delight, he found it was quite loose. Using the rifle barrel as a crowbar, he managed to lever it out from the wall. He worked quickly, then took hold with both hands and wrenched the whole concern away, hurling it down with the thing still clinging to it into the garden. For a few minutes longer he waited, listening, but after the first general outcry he heard nothing. He knew now there was no more reason to fear attack from this quarter. He had removed the only means of reaching the window, and as none of the other windows had adjacent water pipes to tempt the monster's climbing powers, he began to feel more confident. Leaving the room, he made his way down to the study, anxious to see how the door had withstood the last assault. Entering, he lit 2 candles and turned to the door. One of the large props had been displaced, and on that side the door had been forced inward some 6 inches. It was providential he had managed to drive the brutes away just when he did, and that coping stone, he wondered vaguely how he had managed to dislodge it. He had not noticed it loose as he took his shot, and then, as he stood up, it had slipped away from beneath him. He felt he owed the dismissal of the attacking force more to its timely fall than to his rifle. Then the thought came that he had better seize this chance to shore up the door again. The creatures had evidently not returned since the coping stone fell, but who could say how long they would keep away? He set to repairing the door immediately, working hard and anxiously. First he went down to the basement and, rummaging around, found several pieces of heavy oak planking. With these he returned to the study, removed the props, placed the planks up against the door, and nailed the heads of the struts to them, driving them well home at the bottoms and nailing them there again. Thus he made the door stronger than ever now, solid with the backing of boards, and he felt convinced it would stand heavier pressure than before without giving way. After that, he lit the kitchen lamp and went down to have a look at the lower windows. Now that he had seen the creature's strength, he felt considerable anxiety about the ground floor windows, in spite of the fact they were strongly barred. He went first to the buttery, having a vivid remembrance of his late adventure there. The place was chilly, and the wind soughing through the broken glass produced an eerie note. Apart from the general air of dismalness, the place was as he had left it the night before. Going up to the window, he examined the bars closely, noting their comfortable thickness. Yet, as he looked more intently, it seemed the middle bar was bent slightly from the straight, but it was but trifling, and might have been so for years. He had never noticed them particularly before. He put his hand through the broken window and shook the bar. It was as firm as a rock. Perhaps the creatures had tried to start it and found it beyond their power. After that, he went around to each of the windows in turn, examining them with careful attention, but nowhere else could he trace anything to show tampering. Having finished his survey, he went back to the study, poured himself a little brandy, then went to the tower to watch. The hour was just past 3 in the morning, and the first pale touch of dawn was beginning to seep across the eastern sky. The light grew slowly, revealing the gardens in gray detail. He scanned the grounds intently from his tower perch, but found no trace of the creatures anywhere. Leaning forward, he checked the base of the wall where he'd shot one of the swine things the night before the body was gone. Presumably, the others had retrieved it during the darkness. He crossed the roof to the gap where the coping stone had fallen and peered over the edge. The massive stone was still there, exactly as he'd left it, but no bodies lay beneath or near it. Those he'd crushed had also been removed. Evidently, the monsters had reclaimed their dead. He turned and descended to the study, collapsing into his chair with a bone-deep exhaustion. The morning was fully bright now, though the sun's warmth had not yet touched the air. Somewhere, a clock chimed 4. He woke with a start, jerking upright and casting his gaze around the room in confusion. The corner clock told him it was 3 in the afternoon. He'd been asleep nearly 11 hours. He sat forward abruptly, listening, but the house was utterly silent. He rose slowly, yawning, still desperate for rest, and sank back into the chair. What had woken him? Probably the chime of the clock, he decided, and was just beginning to drift off again, when a sudden sound snapped him fully awake, footsteps moving cautiously down the corridor, heading toward the study. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, waiting in absolute silence. Had the creatures broken in while he slept? The steps reached his door, paused, and then continued on down the passage. He crept to the doorway on silent feet and peered out. Relief flooded through him. It was his sister, heading for the stairs. He stepped into the hallway, about to call out to her, when a troubling thought stopped him. Why had she crept past his door so stealthily? For a fleeting moment, he wondered if this wasn't his sister at all but some new horror of the house. Then he caught a glimpse of her familiar old petticoat and nearly laughed at his own foolishness. No mistaking that garment. Still, her behavior troubled him. Remembering her disturbed state from the day before, he decided to follow quietly without alarming her, to see what she intended. If she was rational, no harm done. If not, he'd have to restrain her. With the danger they faced, he couldn't afford unnecessary risks. He reached the top of the stairs and paused, then heard a sound that sent him flying down in a panic. The rattle of bolts being drawn, his sister was unbarring the back door. He reached her just as her hand touched the last bolt. She hadn't seen him coming, and when he seized her arm, she started like a terrified animal and screamed. He demanded to know what she was doing, how she could be so reckless with both their lives, but she couldn't answer, only trembled violently, gasping and sobbing with sheer terror. He tried reasoning with her, urging caution, telling her to be brave. He insisted there was little to fear now, trying even to convince himself, but she had to be sensible and stay inside for a few days. Eventually, he gave up in despair. She was clearly not herself. He told her to go to her room if she couldn't behave rationally, but she gave no response. So he lifted her in his arms and carried her there. She screamed wildly at first, but had lapsed into silent shaking by the time they reached the stairs. He laid her on the bed where she lay still, trembling uncontrollably but not speaking. He covered her with a rug, then crossed to where Pepper lay in his basket. His sister had been nursing the dog despite her own distress, and he was grateful to see the old animal had been well cared for. He spoke softly to Pepper, who responded with a feeble lick to his hand, too weak to do more. He returned to his sister's bedside and asked how she felt, but she only shook more violently. Much as it pained him, he had to accept that his presence seemed to worsen her fear. He locked her in and pocketed the key, seeing no other choice. The rest of that long, weary day he spent between the tower and the study, subsisting on nothing but bread and claret. The hours crawled by. If only he could walk the gardens as he usually did, he could have borne it. But being cooped up in the silent house with only a mad woman and a sick dog for company was enough to fray anyone's nerves. And out there in the tangled shrubberies, those hellish swine things might still be waiting. Twice he visited his sister, once in the afternoon and again later. The second time he found her tending Pepper, but she shrank away from him, retreating to the far corner. The gesture cut him deeply, but he wouldn't intrude on her further. He trusted she'd recover in a few days, and in the meantime he kept her confined, hard as it was. At least she'd eaten the food he'd brought her. As evening came on and the air chilled, he prepared for a second night in the tower. He carried up 2 additional rifles and a heavy coat, loading all 3 weapons and positioning them ready. He intended to make any attacking creature pay dearly. With plenty of ammunition, he planned to teach the brutes the futility of trying to force entry. He made another round of the house afterward, paying special attention to the props bracing the study door. Finally satisfied he'd done everything possible, he returned to the tower, stopping once more to check on his sister and Pepper. The dog woke at his entrance and wagged his tail weakly. He seemed a little better. His sister lay on the bed, but he couldn't tell if she was asleep. He left them and climbed to the tower. He settled in as comfortably as he could, preparing to watch through the night. Darkness fell, blurring the gardens into formless shadows. For the first hours he sat alert, straining his ears for any sign of movement below, though the darkness made his eyes nearly useless. Hours passed without incident. The moon rose, revealing apparently empty, silent gardens. The night wore on, quiet and disturbing. Toward morning he grew stiff and cold from the long vigil, and a deep unease gnawed at him over the creature's continued silence. He mistrusted it. He'd have preferred an open attack. At least then he'd know the danger and face it directly. This waiting, imagining all manner of unknown horrors, was a threat to his sanity. He allowed himself to wonder whether the things had gone, but deep down he couldn't believe it was true. Weariness, cold, and a gnawing unease finally drove him from the tower. He decided to walk through the house, stopping first in the study for a glass of brandy to warm himself. While there, he inspected the door carefully, finding everything exactly as he'd left it the night before. Dawn was just breaking as he left the tower, but the house interior remained too dark to navigate without a light. He took one of the study candles with him as he began his rounds. By the time he'd finished inspecting the ground floor, wan daylight was seeping through the barred windows. His search had revealed nothing amiss. Everything seemed in order. He was about to extinguish the candle when the thought struck him to check the cellars again. He hadn't been down there since his hasty search on the night of the attack. He hesitated for perhaps half a minute. The task was one. He would have gladly avoided the cellars, with the most vast and unnerving spaces in the entire house, great gloomy caverns that never saw daylight, yet he refused to shirk the duty. Cowardice was not an option. Besides, he reassured himself, the cellars were the least likely place to find anything dangerous, given that they could only be entered through a heavy oak door, the key to which he always carried. The smallest of these subterranean chambers held his wine a dismal hole near the foot of the cellar stairs. Beyond that, he'd rarely ventured. Apart from the earlier hasty rummage, he doubted he'd ever fully explored the cellars at all. Unlocking the great door at the top of the stairs, he paused nervously at the strange, desolate smell that assailed him. Then, leveling his weapon, he descended slowly into the underground darkness. At the bottom he stood listening for a full minute. Silence, save for the faint drip of water falling somewhere to his left. He noticed how steadily the candle burned, not a flicker, not a flare, in the utterly windless air. He moved quietly from cellar to cellar, his memory of their arrangement dim and blurred. He recalled a succession of great vaults, one larger than the rest with a roof supported by pillars, but beyond that his mind held only a haze of cold darkness and shadows. Now, however, though still nervous, he was collected enough to observe his surroundings, properly noting the structure and dimensions of each vault he entered. The candlelight prevented minute examination, but he could see that the walls were built with remarkable precision and finish, with massive pillars rising here and there to support the vaulted ceilings. He reached the great cellar at last, entering through a huge arched doorway covered with strange, fantastic carvings that cast queer shadows in the candlelight. He paused to examine them, struck by how little he knew of his own house, though it was understandable given the size of the ancient pile and the fact that only he and his sister occupied a handful of rooms. Holding the light high, he passed into the cellar, keeping to the right wall as he paced slowly to the far end, glancing cautiously about. The light revealed nothing unusual. At the end he turned left, still following the wall, and continued until he traversed the entire vast chamber. The floor was solid rock, in places covered with damp mold, in others bare save for a thin coating of light gray dust. He'd paused at the doorway but now turned and made his way up the center of the place, passing among the pillars and glancing to both sides. About halfway across, his foot struck something that clinked metallically. He stooped quickly with the candle and saw a large metal ring. Clearing away the dust, he discovered it was attached to a ponderous trap door, black with age. Curiosity and excitement stirred him. Where could it lead? He laid his gun on the floor, stuck the candle in the trigger guard, took the ring in both hands, and pulled. The trap creaked loudly, echoes reverberating through the vast space, and opened heavily. Propping the edge on his knee, he reached for the candle and held it over the opening, moving it left and right, but saw nothing. No steps, no sign there had ever been any. Only empty blackness, like looking into a bottomless, sideless well. Then, as he stared in bewilderment, he seemed to hear a faint whisper of sound from far below. He bent closer, listening intently. It might have been fancy, but he could have sworn he heard a soft titter that grew into a hideous, distant chuckling. Startled, he leaped backward, letting the trap fall with a hollow clang that filled the place with echoes. Even then he seemed to hear that mocking laughter. Though he knew it must be imagination, the sound he'd heard was far too faint to penetrate the heavy trap. For a full minute he stood quivering, glancing nervously around him, but the great cellar was silent as a grave. Gradually, he shook off the frightened sensation. With a calmer mind, curiosity returned about where the trap led, but he couldn't summon the courage for further investigation. He did feel, however, that the trap should be secured. He accomplished this by placing several large pieces of dressed stone over it, stones he'd noticed during his tour along the east wall. After one final scrutiny of the rest of the place, he retraced his way through the cellars to the stairs and emerged into the daylight with an immense feeling of relief that the uncomfortable task was done. The sun was now warm and bright, a wondrous contrast to the dark cellars, and he made his way up to the tower with comparatively light feelings. The gardens were quiet. After a few minutes, he went down to Mary's room. He knocked, received a reply, and unlocked the door. His sister sat quietly on the bed as though waiting. She seemed herself again, making no attempt to move away when he approached, though he noticed she scanned his face anxiously, still half afraid of him, as if not entirely convinced he meant her no harm. When he asked how she felt, she replied sensibly enough that she was hungry and would like to go down to prepare breakfast if he didn't mind. He considered for a moment whether it was safe to let her out, then agreed on condition she promised not to attempt leaving the house or meddling with any of the outer doors. At the mention of the doors, a sudden look of fright crossed her face, but she said nothing beyond giving the required promise, then left the room silently. He crossed to Pepper, who had woken at his entrance, and greeted him with a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft tail rapping. When he patted the dog, Pepper tried to stand, succeeding only to fall back with a little yowl of pain. He told the animal to lie still, delighted with his improvement, and grateful for his sister's kindness in caring for the old dog despite her own troubled state. After a while he left and went downstairs to the study. Soon Mary appeared with a tray bearing a steaming hot breakfast. As she entered, he saw her gaze fix on the prop supporting the study door. Her lips tightened, and she seemed to pale slightly, but she said nothing. She set the tray at his elbow, and was leaving quietly when he called her back. She came timidly, as though startled, and he noticed her hand clutching nervously at her apron. He tried to lift her spirits, insisting that things were looking brighter since he'd seen none of the creatures since early the previous morning. She looked at him with a curiously puzzled expression, as though she didn't understand his words. Then comprehension dawned in her eyes, followed swiftly by fear. She only murmured something unintelligible in response. He said nothing further after that. Clearly any reference to the swine things was more than her shattered nerves could handle. Breakfast finished, he climbed to the tower and maintained a strict watch over the gardens for most of the day. Once or twice he went down to check on his sister, finding her quiet and strangely submissive each time. On the last visit, she actually ventured to address him first, asking about some household matter that needed attention. Though she spoke with extraordinary timidity, he welcomed it as a hopeful sign, the first voluntary words she'd spoken since the crisis, when he'd caught her unbarring the back door. He wondered if she remembered that attempt and how close a call it had been, but he didn't question her, thinking it best to let the matter rest. That night, he slept in an actual bed for the first time in 2 nights. He rose early and walked through the house, finding everything in order, then climbed to the tower to survey the gardens. Again, perfect quiet. At breakfast he was greatly pleased to see Mary had regained enough composure to greet him naturally. She talked sensibly and quietly, carefully avoiding any mention of the past few days. He humored her by not steering the conversation in that direction. Earlier he'd visited Pepper, who was mending rapidly and seemed likely to be on his feet in another day or two. He mentioned the dog's improvement at breakfast, and during the brief discussion that followed, he was surprised to gather from Mary's remarks that she still believed Pepper's wound came from the wildcat he'd invented. The deception made him almost ashamed, though he'd lied only to spare her fear. Besides, he'd assumed she must have learned the truth when the creatures attacked the house. He remained alert throughout the day, spending much of his time in the tower, but saw no sign of the swine creatures, and heard nothing. Several times he entertained the thought that the things had finally left them, though he'd refused to take the idea seriously until now. He began to feel a reason for hope. It would soon be 3 days since he'd seen any of them. Still, he intended to use utmost caution. This protracted silence might be a ruse to lure him out of the house, into their grasp. That possibility alone kept him circumspect. The 4th, 5th, and 6th days passed quietly without his leaving the house. On the 6th day he had the pleasure of seeing Pepper on his feet again, and though still very weak, the dog kept him company all day. Time crawled by with nothing to suggest the brute still infested the gardens. On the 9th day, he finally decided to risk venturing out. He carefully loaded a shotgun, choosing it over the rifle as more deadly at close quarters, and after one last scrutiny of the grounds from the tower, he called Pepper to follow, and went down to the basement. At the door he hesitated. The thought of what might be waiting among the dark shrubberies didn't encourage his resolve, but only a second passed before he drew the bolts and stepped onto the path outside. Pepper followed, pausing at the doorstep to sniff suspiciously, his nose traveling up and down the door jambs as though following a scent. Then he turned sharply and began running in semicircles and circles around the door, finally returning to the threshold to nose about again. He'd been watching the dog while keeping half his attention on the wild tangle of gardens around him. Now he went to Pepper and examined the door's surface where the dog was smelling. The wood was covered with a tangled network of scratches, crisscrossing each other in chaotic confusion. The doorposts themselves were gnawed in places. Beyond that he found nothing. He straightened and began a circuit of the house wall. Pepper left the door as soon as he walked away and ran ahead, still nosing and sniffing as he went. At times he stopped to investigate a bullet hole in the pathway, a powder-stained wad, a torn piece of sod, a disturbed patch of weedy path. But he found nothing substantial. He watched the dog critically and could detect no uneasiness indicating the nearness of any creatures. Pepper wouldn't be easily deceived if danger were present. He'd know and give warning. This assurance was a relief. He stopped at the spot where he'd shot the first creature and made a careful scrutiny, but saw nothing. He moved on to where the great coping stone had fallen. It lay on its side, apparently just as he'd left it after shooting the brute that had been moving it. A couple of feet to the right of the nearer end was a large dent in the ground where it had struck. He went closer and studied the stone. What a massive piece of masonry, and that creature had moved it single-handedly in its attempt to reach what lay beneath. Circling to the far end, he found he could see under the stone for nearly 2 feet, but there was no trace of the stricken creatures, and he was puzzled. He'd guessed the remains had been removed, but couldn't understand how it could have been done so thoroughly. He'd seen several brutes struck down beneath that stone with such force they must have been driven into the earth, yet now, not a vestige remained, not even a bloodstain. He turned the matter over in his mind but could think of no plausible explanation, finally giving it up as one of the many unexplainable things. He moved on to examine the study door, now seeing even more clearly the effects of the tremendous strain it had endured. He marveled that it had withstood the attack so well even with the prop support. There were no marks of blows. None had been given, but the door had been literally riven from its hinges by enormous silent force. One thing affected him profoundly. The head of one prop had been driven right through a panel. This alone showed how great the creature's efforts had been and how close they'd come to succeeding. He continued his circuit, finding little else of interest except at the back, where he came across the piece of piping he'd torn from the wall, lying in the long grass beneath the broken window. He returned to the house, bolted the back door, and went up to the tower, spending the afternoon reading and occasionally glancing down at the gardens. He'd decided that if the night passed quietly, he would go as far as the pit tomorrow. Perhaps then he might learn something of what had happened. The day slipped away, and the night came and went much like the previous ones. When he rose, the morning had broken fine and clear. He put his plan into action. Over breakfast he considered the matter carefully, then went to the study for his shotgun. He also loaded a small but heavy pistol and slipped it into his pocket. He understood that if there was any danger, it lay in the direction of the pit, and he intended to be prepared. Leaving the study, he went down to the back door with Pepper following. Once outside, he took a quick survey of the surrounding gardens, then set off toward the pit, keeping a sharp lookout with his gun held ready. Pepper ran ahead without any apparent hesitation, which suggested there was no imminent danger, and he quickened his pace in the dog's wake. Pepper had reached the top of the pit and was nosing his way along the edge. A minute later he stood beside the dog looking down. For a moment he could scarcely believe it was the same place. The dark, wooded ravine of a fortnight ago, with its foliage-hidden stream sluggishly running at the bottom, was gone. Instead, he saw a ragged chasm partly filled with a gloomy lake of turbid water. One entire side of the ravine was stripped of underwood, exposing bare rock. A little to his left, the pit side appeared to have collapsed completely, forming a deep V-shaped cleft in the face of the rocky cliff. This rift ran from the upper edge of the ravine nearly down to the water, penetrating into the pit side for about 40 feet. Its opening was at least 6 yards across, tapering to about 2. But what drew his attention more than even the stupendous split itself was a great hole some distance down the cleft, right in the angle of the V. It was clearly defined and not unlike an arched doorway in shape, though lying in shadow he couldn't see it very distinctly. The opposite side of the pit still held its greenery, but it was so torn in places and everywhere coated with dust and debris that it was barely recognizable. His initial assumption of a simple landslip no longer seemed sufficient to explain all the changes he witnessed. And the water, where had it come from? He turned suddenly, aware of running water somewhere to his right. He couldn't see it at first, but now that his attention was caught, he easily distinguished the sound coming from the pit's eastern end. He made his way slowly in that direction, the sound growing plainer as he advanced until he stood directly above it. Still he couldn't perceive the cause until he knelt and thrust his head over the cliff. Below, a torrent of clear water issued from a small fissure in the pit side and rushed down the rocks into the lake. A little further along he saw another, and beyond that 2 smaller ones. These would account for much of the water, and if the fall of rock and earth had blocked the outlet at the bottom, the original stream would be contributing a large share as well. Yet he puzzled over the generally shaken appearance of the place, these new streamlets, the huge cleft further up the ravine. More than a landslip seemed necessary to explain it all. An earthquake or a great explosion could have created such conditions, but neither had occurred. He stood up abruptly, remembering that crash and the cloud of dust that had rushed high into the air, but he shook his head, unbelieving. It must have been the noise of falling rocks and earth he'd heard. Of course the dust would fly naturally. Still, despite his reasoning, he had an uneasy feeling that this theory didn't satisfy his sense of what was probable. Yet what other explanation was half as plausible? Pepper had been sitting on the grass while he conducted his examination, and rose to follow as he turned up the north side of the ravine. He made the circuit of the pit slowly, keeping careful watch in all directions, but found little he hadn't already seen. From the west end he could see the 4 waterfalls uninterrupted, rising some considerable distance from the lake's surface, about 50 feet, he calculated. He loitered a little longer, eyes and ears open, but saw and heard nothing suspicious. The whole place was wonderfully quiet, save for the continuous murmur of water at the top end. Pepper had shown no uneasiness throughout, which suggested there were no swine creatures in the vicinity for now. The dog's attention seemed occupied chiefly with scratching and sniffing among the grass at the pit's edge. At times he'd leave the edge and run toward the house, as though following invisible tracks, but always returned after a few minutes. He had little doubt Pepper was tracing the swine thing's footsteps, and the fact that each trail seemed to lead back to the pit appeared to prove the brutes had all returned whence they came. At noon he went home for dinner. During the afternoon he made a partial search of the gardens with Pepper, finding nothing to indicate the creature's presence. Once, passing through the shrubberies, Pepper rushed among some bushes with a fierce yelp. He jumped back in sudden fright, throwing his gun forward, ready only to laugh nervously as Pepper reappeared chasing an unfortunate cat. Toward evening he gave up the search and returned to the house. Passing a great clump of bushes on their right, Pepper disappeared, and he could hear the dogs sniffing and growling suspiciously among them. He parted the shrubbery with his gun barrel and looked inside. Nothing was visible, but many of the branches were bent and broken, as though some animal had made a lair there recently. Probably one of the spots occupied by the swine creatures on the night of the attack. He resumed his search through the gardens the next day, but found nothing. By evening he'd been right through them, and now knew beyond doubt that none of the things remained concealed about the place. He often thought afterward that his earlier surmise had been correct. They'd left soon after the attack. Another week came and went, during which he spent a great deal of time around the pit mouth. He'd concluded a few days earlier that the arched hole in the angle of the great rift was where the swine things had emerged from some unholy place in the earth's bowels. How near the truth this was, he'd learn later. He was tremendously curious, though frightened, about where that hole led, but hadn't seriously considered investigating. His horror of the swine creatures was too strong to willingly venture anywhere he might encounter them. Gradually, however, as time passed, that feeling diminished. A few days later, when the thought occurred to him that he might clamber down and look into the hole, he found himself less averse than he'd have imagined. Still, he didn't think he actually intended to try any such foolhardy adventure. It might well mean certain death to enter that doleful opening. Yet such is the persistence of human curiosity that his chief desire became simply to discover what lay beyond that gloomy entrance. Slowly as the days passed, his fear of the swine things receded into memory, more an unpleasant, incredible recollection than anything else. A day came when, throwing caution aside, he procured a rope from the house, made it fast to a stout tree at the top of the rift some distance back from the pit edge, and let the other end down into the cleft until it dangled right across the mouth of the dark hole. He climbed down cautiously, despite many misgivings about the madness of his attempt, using the rope for support until he reached the hole. Still holding the rope, he stood and peered inside. Perfect darkness, and not a sound until a moment later, when he seemed to hear something. He held his breath and listened, but silence returned, and he breathed freely again. Then the sound came again, like labored breathing, deep and sharp drawn. For a brief second he stood petrified, unable to move, but the sound ceased once more. As he stood there anxiously, his foot dislodged a pebble that fell inward with a hollow chink. The noise was taken up and repeated dozens of times, each echo fainter, seeming to travel away into remote distance. When silence fell again, he heard that stealthy breathing. For each breath he took, he heard an answering breath. The sound seemed to be coming nearer, and then he heard several others, fainter and more distant. Why he didn't grip the rope and spring up out of danger, he couldn't say. He seemed paralyzed. He broke into a profuse sweat, tried to moisten his lips with his tongue. His throat had gone dry, and he coughed huskily. The sound came back to him in a dozen horrible throaty tones, mockingly. He peered helplessly into the gloom, but nothing showed. He had a strange, choky sensation, and coughed again, dryly. Again the echo took it up, rising and falling grotesquely, dying slowly into muffled silence. Then a thought came to him, and he held his breath. The other breathing stopped. He breathed again, and it resumed. But now he no longer feared. He knew the strange sounds weren't made by any lurking swine creature, but were simply the echo of his own respirations. Yet the fright had been so severe, he was glad to scramble up the rift and haul up the rope. He was far too shaken and nervous to think of entering that dark hole then, and returned to the house. He felt more himself the next morning, but still couldn't summon enough courage to explore the place. All this time the water in the pit had been creeping slowly up, now standing just below the opening. At the rate it was rising, it would reach the floor in less than a week. He realized that unless he investigated soon, he'd probably never do so. The water would rise until the opening itself was submerged. That thought may have spurred him to action. Whatever the reason, a couple of days later found him standing at the top of the cleft, fully equipped for the task. This time, he was resolved to overcome his hesitation and go through with it. He'd brought the rope, a bundle of candles to use as a torch, and his double-barreled shotgun. In his belt, he carried a heavy horse pistol loaded with buckshot. He fastened the rope to the tree as before, tied the gun across his shoulders with stout cord, and lowered himself over the pit edge. Pepper, who'd been watching his actions warily, rose and ran to him with what seemed a half-bark, half-wail of warning. But he was resolved, and ordered the dog to lie down. He'd have liked to take Pepper with him, but that was nearly impossible in the circumstances. As his face dropped level with the pit edge, Pepper licked him across the mouth, then seized his sleeve between his teeth and pulled back strongly. It was clear the dog didn't want him to go, but his mind was made up with a sharp command for Pepper to release him. He continued his descent, leaving the poor old fellow at the top barking and crying like a forsaken pup. He lowered himself carefully from one rocky projection to the next, knowing a slip could mean a wetting at best. Reaching the entrance, he released the rope and untied the gun from his shoulders. A last glance at the sky showed it clouding over rapidly. He moved forward a few paces to get out of the wind and lit one of his candles. Holding it high above his head and gripping his gun firmly, he began moving slowly onward, casting his gaze in all directions. For the first minute, he could hear Pepper's melancholy howling from above, but as he penetrated deeper into the darkness, the sound faded until nothing reached him. The path sloped downward and to the left, continuing in that direction until he realized it was leading him straight toward the house. He moved with extreme caution, stopping every few steps to listen. He'd gone perhaps 100 yards when he caught a faint sound from somewhere behind him in the passage. His heart thudded heavily. As he listened, the noise grew plainer, approaching rapidly. The soft padding of running feet. In the first moments of fright he stood frozen, unsure whether to go forward or back. Then, deciding quickly, he backed up against the rocky wall on his right, held the candle above his head, and waited, with his gun ready, cursing his foolhardy curiosity that had brought him to this pass. He didn't have to wait long. Two eyes reflected back the candlelight from the gloom ahead. He raised his gun one-handed, and aimed, then something burst from the darkness with a blustering bark of joy that woke the echoes like thunder. It was Pepper. How the dog had scrambled down the cleft he couldn't imagine. As he brushed his hand nervously over the animal's coat, he noticed Pepper was dripping wet. He must have tried to follow, and fallen into the water, from which climbing out wouldn't have been difficult. After a moment to steady himself, he proceeded along the way with Pepper following quietly. He was curiously glad to have the old dog with him. The company eased his fear, and he knew Pepper's keen ears would detect any unwelcome presence in the darkness around them. They went slowly for some minutes, the path still leading straight toward the house. Soon, he concluded, they'd be standing right beneath it. He led the way cautiously another 50 yards or so, then stopped and held the light high and was thankful he'd done so. Not 3 paces ahead, the path vanished into hollow blackness. He crept forward carefully and peered down, but could see nothing. He crossed to the left side of the passage and found a narrow track about 3 feet wide leading onward. He stepped onto it carefully, but soon regretted it after a few paces. The way narrowed to a mere ledge, with solid rock towering up on one side and the yawning chasm on the other. He reflected grimly how helpless he'd be if attacked there, with no room to turn, and even his weapon's recoil possibly driving him into the depths. To his relief, the track broadened again after a little further. As he went on, he noticed the path trending steadily to the right, and after some minutes realized he wasn't going forward at all but simply circling the huge abyss. He'd reached the end of the passage. 5 minutes later he stood back where he'd started, having gone completely around what he now guessed was a vast pit, at least 100 yards across. He stood there for some time, lost in perplexed thought. What does it all mean? Echoed through his brain. An idea struck him. He searched for a piece of stone and found a chunk about the size of a small loaf. He stuck the candle upright in a crevice, stepped back from the edge, took a short run, and launched the stone into the chasm, throwing it far enough to clear the sides. He stooped forward and listened, but even after a full minute of perfect silence, no sound came back from the dark. He knew then the depth must be immense. The stone was large enough to have set the echoes whispering for an indefinite time, if it had struck anything. Even as it was, the cavern had multiplied the sounds of his own footsteps. The place was awesome, and he'd willingly have turned back, leaving its mysteries unsolved, but that would mean admitting defeat. Another thought came. If he placed his candles around the edge, he might get some dim view of the abyss. He counted 15 candles in his bundle. His original plan had been to make a torch of them all. He placed them around the pit mouth at intervals of about 20 yards. Completing the circle, he stood in the passage and tried to get an idea of how the place looked, but the candles were totally insufficient. They did little more than make the gloom visible. They did confirm his estimate of the opening size, and the contrast they provided against the heavy darkness pleased him curiously, like 15 tiny stars shining through the subterranean night. Then Pepper gave a sudden howl that the echoes took up and repeated with ghastly variations. He held aloft the one candle he'd kept and glanced at the dog. At the same moment, he seemed to hear a diabolical chuckle rising from the silent depths. He started, then recollected it was probably the echo of Pepper's howl. Pepper had moved a few steps up the passage, nosing along the rocky floor, and he thought he heard the dog lapping. He went toward him, holding the candle low, and heard his own boot go sop, sop. The light reflected from something glistening that crept past his feet swiftly toward the pit. He bent lower and saw a stream of water running from higher up the path toward the great opening, growing larger every second. Pepper gave that deep howl again and ran at him, seizing his coat and trying to drag him back up the path. He shook the dog off nervously and crossed quickly to the left-hand wall if anything was coming. He wanted the wall at his back. As he stared anxiously up the passage, his candle caught a gleam far ahead. At the same moment, a murmurous roar grew louder, filling the cavern with deafening sound. From the pit came a deep hollow echo like a giant's sob. He sprang onto the narrow ledge running around the abyss, and a great wall of foam swept past him, leaping tumultuously into the waiting chasm. A cloud of spray burst over him, extinguishing his candle and soaking him to the skin. He still held his gun. The 3 nearest candles went out. The others only flickered briefly. After the first rush, the water eased to a steady stream perhaps a foot deep, though he couldn't see this until he'd retrieved one of the lighted candles and started to reconnoiter. Pepper had followed him onto the ledge and now kept close behind, subdued. A short examination showed the water stretched right across the passage, running at a tremendous rate and deepening even as he stood there. He could only guess what had happened. Evidently the water in the ravine had broken into the passage somehow. If so, it would go on increasing until he couldn't leave at all. The thought was frightening. He had to get out as quickly as possible. He sounded the water with his gun a little under knee-deep. The noise of it plunging into the pit was deafening. With a call to Pepper, he stepped into the flood, using the gun as a staff. The water boiled up over his knees nearly to his thighs with the speed of its racing current. He nearly lost his footing, but the thought of what lay behind spurred him to fierce effort, and step by step he made headway. Of Pepper he knew nothing at first. He had all he could do to stay on his feet. He was overjoyed when the dog appeared beside him, wading manfully along. Pepper's long, thin legs seemed less affected by the water's grasp, and he managed far better, going ahead like a guide and helping to break the force of the current. They struggled on step by step until they'd safely traversed about 100 yards. Then, whether from less care or a slippery patch of rock, he slipped and fell face first. The water leapt over him in a cataract, hurling him toward that bottomless hole at frightful speed. He struggled frantically, but couldn't get a footing, helpless, gasping, drowning. Then something gripped his coat and brought him to a standstill. Pepper, the dog must have missed him, raced back through the dark turmoil, found him, and held him until he could get to his feet. He had a dim recollection of seeing several lights momentarily, though he was never quite sure. If his impressions were correct, he'd been washed to the very brink of the chasm before Pepper managed to stop him. The lights could only have been the distant flames of the candles he'd left burning, but he wasn't at all certain. His eyes were full of water, and he'd been badly shaken. And there he was, without his helpful gun, without light, sadly confused, with the water deepening, depending solely on his old friend Pepper to help him out of that hellish place. He faced directly into the torrent, the only position that allowed him to hold his ground even for a moment. Even Pepper couldn't have kept him against that terrific strain without his own blind assistance. Perhaps a minute passed, touch and go, before he slowly resumed his tortuous way up the passage. The grimmest fight with death he'd ever faced had begun. Slowly, furiously, almost hopelessly he struggled, while faithful Pepper led and dragged him upward and onward, until at last a gleam of blessed light appeared ahead, the entrance. Only a few yards more and he reached the opening, with the water surging and boiling hungrily around his waist. Now he understood the catastrophe. Rain was falling heavily, literally, in torrents. The lake's surface was level with the opening's bottom, more than level, actually above it. The rain had swollen the lake and caused this premature rise. At the rate the ravine had been filling, it wouldn't have reached the entrance for another 2 days. The rope he'd descended on was streaming into the opening on the inrushing waters. He seized the end, knotted it securely around Pepper's body, summoned the last remnant of his strength, and began swarming up the cliffside. He reached the pit edge in the last stage of exhaustion, yet had to make one more effort haul Pepper to safety. Slowly and wearily he pulled on the rope. Once or twice it seemed he'd have to give up. Pepper was a heavy dog, and he was utterly spent, but letting go would have meant certain death for the old fellow, and that thought spurred him to greater exertions. He had only a hazy memory of the end pulling through moments that lagged strangely, and a recollection of seeing Pepper's muzzle appear over the pit edge after what seemed an indefinite time. Then everything went dark. He must have swooned. The next thing he remembered was opening his eyes in dusk. He lay on his back, one leg twisted under the other, with Pepper licking his ears. He felt horribly stiff, his leg numb from the knee down. He lay in a daze for a few minutes, then slowly struggled to a sitting position and looked around. The rain had stopped, but the trees still dripped dismally. From the pit came a continuous murmur of running water. He felt cold and shivery, his clothes sodden, his body aching all over. The life crept slowly back into his numbed leg, and after a little he tried to stand, managing it on the second attempt, though very tottery and weak. He sensed he was going to be ill and stumbled toward the house, his steps erratic, his head confused, sharp pains shooting through his limbs with every step. He'd gone perhaps 30 paces when Pepper's cry drew his attention. The old dog was trying to follow, but couldn't come further. The rope he'd used to haul him up was still tied around his body, the other end still fastened to the tree. He fumbled weakly with the wet hard knots but could do nothing. Then he remembered his knife, and in a minute the rope was cut. How he reached the house he scarcely knew, and of the days that followed, he remembered even less. But of one thing he was certain: without his sister's untiring love and nursing, he wouldn't be writing now. When he finally recovered his senses, he found he'd been in bed nearly 2 weeks. Another week passed before he was strong enough to totter into the gardens, and even then he couldn't walk as far as the pit. He would have liked to ask his sister how high the water had risen, but judged it wiser not to mention the subject to her. Indeed, since then he'd made it a rule never to speak to her about the strange things that happened in the house. A couple of days later, he managed to get across to the pit. There he found a wondrous change in his few weeks' absence. Instead of the 3 parts filled ravine, he looked out upon a great lake, whose placid surface reflected the light coldly. The water had risen to within 6 feet of the pit edge. Only one part of the lake was disturbed above, where, far down under the silent waters, the entrance to the vast underground pit yawned. Here there was continuous bubbling, and occasionally a curious sobbing gurgle rose from the depths. Beyond that, nothing told of what lay hidden beneath. As he stood there, he realized how wonderfully things had worked out. The entrance to the swine creature's place was sealed by a power that made him feel there was nothing more to fear from them. Yet with that relief came the sensation that he would never learn anything further of where those dreadful things had come from. It was completely shut off and concealed from human curiosity forever. Strange, he thought, how apposite the naming of the pit had become. The shape and depth of the ravine would naturally suggest the name, but perhaps it had always held a deeper significance. A hint, could one but have guessed, of the greater, more stupendous pit far down in the earth beneath the house. The idea was strange and terrible to him. He had proved beyond doubt that the pit yawned right below the house, which was evidently supported somewhere above its center upon a tremendous arched roof of solid rock. It happened when he'd occasion to go down to the cellars and thought to visit the great vault where the trap was, to see if everything remained as he'd left it. Reaching the place, he walked slowly up the center to where the trap sat with the stones piled upon it. He had a lantern, and the idea struck him to investigate whatever lay beneath the great oak slab. He placed the lantern on the floor, tumbled the stones off the trap, grasped the ring, and pulled the door open. The cellar filled with a murmurous thunder rising from far below, and a damp wind blew into his face, bringing a load of fine spray. He dropped the trap hurriedly, half frightened and wondering. He stood puzzled for a moment, not particularly afraid, for the haunting fear of the swine things had left him long ago, but certainly nervous and astonished. A sudden thought possessed him, and he raised the ponderous door with excitement, leaving it standing on its end. He seized the lantern, knelt, and thrust it into the opening. The moist wind and spray drove into his eyes, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, he could distinguish nothing below but darkness and whirling spray. Realizing it was useless to expect to see anything with the light so high, he felt in his pockets for twine to lower it further, and the lantern slipped from his fingers, hurtling down into the darkness. For a brief instant he watched its fall, saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam some 80 or 100 feet below, and then it was gone. His sudden surmise was correct. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap, which opened directly above it, and the moisture was spray rising from water falling into the depths. In an instant, he had explanations for things that had puzzled him. Now he understood why the noises on the first night of invasion had seemed to rise directly from under his feet, and the chuckle he'd heard when first opening the trap, evidently some of the swine things must have been right beneath him. Another thought struck him. Were the creatures all drowned? Could they drown? He remembered how unable he'd been to find traces proving his shooting had been fatal. Did they have life as he understood it, or were they ghouls? These thoughts flashed through his mind as he stood in the dark searching his pockets for matches. He had the box in his hand now, struck a light, stepped to the trap door and closed it, then piled the stones back on top and made his way out of the cellars. And so he supposed, the water went on thundering down into that bottomless hell pit. Sometimes he felt an inexplicable desire to go to the great cellar, open the trap, and gaze into the impenetrable spray-damp darkness. At times the desire became almost overpowering, not mere curiosity, but as though some unexplained influence were at work. Still, he never went, intending to fight down the strange longing and crush it as he would the unholy thought of self-destruction. The idea of some intangible force might seem reasonless, but his instinct warned him it was not so. In these things, reason seemed less to be trusted than instinct. One thought impressed itself with ever-growing insistence. He lived in a very strange, a very awful house. He begun to wonder whether he was wise to stay. Yet if he left, where could he go, and still obtain the solitude and the sense of her presence that alone made his old life bearable? For a considerable time after the last incident he'd recorded, he seriously considered leaving the house, and might have done so, but for the great and wonderful thing he was about to describe. How well his heart had advised him to stay, despite all the visions and unexplainable sights. Had he left, he would never have seen again the face of the woman he loved. Few knew of his love, only his sister Mary, and he had loved and lost her. He wanted to write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like tearing open old wounds. Yet after what had happened, what need was there to care? She had come to him out of the unknown. Strangely, she had warned him passionately against the house, begged him to leave, but admitted when he questioned her that she could not have come to him had he been elsewhere. Despite this, she still warned him earnestly, telling him the place was long ago given over to evil, under the power of grim laws known to none here. He asked her again whether she would come to him elsewhere, and she could only stand silent. It was thus he came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she turned it in her dear speech with him. He'd stayed up late in his study reading, and must have dozed over the book. Suddenly he awoke, and sat upright with a start, looking around with a puzzled sense of something unusual. A misty look pervaded the room, giving a curious softness to every table, chair, and furnishing. The mistiness increased gradually, growing out of nothing, and then a soft white light began to glow in the room. The candle flame shone through it palely. He could still see each piece of furniture, but in a strangely unreal way, as though the ghost of each object had taken the place of the solid article. As he watched, they faded gradually into nothingness. The candles shone wanly, and then grew more unreal, and vanished. The room filled with a soft, luminous white twilight, like a gentle mist of light. Beyond this he could see nothing, even the walls had vanished. A faint, continuous sound pulsed through the silence that wrapped him. He listened intently. It grew more distinct, until it seemed he heard the breathings of some great sea. He couldn't tell how long a space passed, but after a while, it seemed he could see through the mistiness, and slowly became aware he was standing on the shore of an immense and silent sea. The shore was smooth and long, vanishing to extreme distances on both sides. Before him swam a still immensity of sleeping ocean. At times he caught faint glimmers of light beneath its surface, but couldn't be sure. Behind him rose gaunt black cliffs of extraordinary height. Overhead, the sky was a uniform cold gray, the whole place lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire, swimming a little above the far horizon, shedding foam-like light across the quiet waters. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea, intense stillness prevailed. For a long while he stayed there, looking out across its strangeness. As he stared, it seemed a bubble of white foam floated up from the depths, and then he knew not how he was looking into the face of her, into her face, into her soul. She looked back at him with such mingled joy and sadness that he ran toward her blindly, crying strangely to her in an agony of remembrance, terror, and hope, to come to him. Yet despite his crying she stayed out upon the sea, shaking her head sorrowfully, though in her eyes was the old earth light of tenderness he'd known before all things, before they were parted. He grew desperate at her perverseness, and tried to weigh it out to her, but something, an invisible barrier, held him back. He was forced to stay where he was and cry out to her with the fullness of his soul, but could say no more for sheer intensity. At that, she came over swiftly and touched him, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet when he reached out his hands to her, she put him from her with tenderly stern hands, and he was abashed. The fragments that followed were barely legible torn pages mentioning tears, had the noise of eternity, their parting. He was dazed for a great time, then alone in the blackness of night, journeying back to the known universe. He emerged from enormous darkness and came among the stars, vast time passing, the sun far and remote. He entered the gulf separating their system from the outer suns, watching the ever-growing brightness and size of their sun as he sped across the dividing dark. He glanced back at the stars and saw them shift in his wake against the mighty background of night, so vast was the speed of his passing spirit. Drawing nearer to their system, he saw the shine of Jupiter, then distinguished the cold blue gleam of earthlight. He had a moment of bewilderment. All about the sun seemed to be bright objects moving in rapid orbits. Inward, near the savage glory of the sun, circled two darting points of light, and further off flew a blue shining speck he knew as Earth, circling the sun in what seemed no more than an Earth minute. He drew nearer with great speed, saw the radiances of Jupiter and Saturn spinning with incredible swiftness in huge orbits, and looked out upon this strange sight, the visible circling of planets about the mother sun, as though time had been annihilated for him. A year was no more to his unfleshed spirit than a moment to an earth-bound soul. The speed of the planets appeared to increase, and presently he watched the sun ringed about with hair-like circles of different-colored fire, the paths of planets hurtling at mighty speed about the central flame. The sun grew vast, as though leaping to meet him, and he was within the circling of the outer planets, flitting swiftly toward where the earth, glimmering through the blue splendor of its orbit, as though a fiery mist, circled the sun at monstrous speed. And now he came to the strangest of all the strange happenings in this house of mysteries, occurring quite lately within the month. He had little doubt that what he saw was in reality the end of all things. He'd never been able to write these things down directly they happened. He had to wait, recovering his balance and digesting what he'd heard or seen. By waiting, he saw incidents more truly and wrote in a calmer frame of mind. It was the end of November, and his story related to what happened in the first week of the month. It was night, about 11 o'clock. Pepper kept him company in the great old study, where he read and worked. He was reading the Bible in those later days. He'd begun taking a growing interest in that great and ancient book. Suddenly, a distinct tremor shook the house, and a faint, distant whirring buzz grew rapidly into a far muffled screaming, reminding him in a queer, gigantic way of the noise a clock makes when the catch is released and it runs down. The sound seemed to come from some remote height somewhere up in the night. The shock wasn't repeated. He looked at Pepper, who slept peacefully. Gradually, the whirring decreased, and a long silence followed. All at once, a glow lit up the end window, which protruded far out from the house's side, so he could look both east and west. Puzzled, he hesitated a moment, then walked across and pulled aside the blind. As he did so, he saw the sun rise from behind the horizon with a steady, perceptible movement. He could see it travel upward, in what seemed a minute, It reached the tops of the trees. Up, up, and it was broad daylight. Behind him he heard a sharp mosquito-like buzzing and glanced around to see it came from the clock. Even as he looked, it marked off an hour. The minute hand moved around the dial faster than an ordinary second hand. The hour hand moved quickly from space to space. He felt numb astonishment. A moment later, it seemed, the two candles went out almost together. He turned swiftly back to the window, having seen the shadow of the window frames traveling along the floor toward him as though a great lamp had been carried up past the window. He saw now that the sun had risen high into the heavens and was still visibly moving. It passed above the house with an extraordinary sailing motion. As the window came into shadow, he witnessed another extraordinary thing. The fine weather clouds weren't drifting easily across the sky, but scampering as though driven by 100-mile-an-hour wind. As they passed, they changed their shapes 1,000 times a minute, writhing with a strange life, and were gone. Others came and whisked away likewise. To the west he saw the sun drop with incredible smooth swiftness. Eastward, the shadows of every visible thing crept toward the coming grayness, and he could see their movement, a stealthy, writhing creep of the shadows of wind-stirred trees. The room began to darken quickly. The sun slid down to the horizon and seemed to disappear almost with a jerk. Through the grayness of the swift evening, he saw the silver crescent of the moon falling out of the southern sky toward the west. The evening merged into almost instant night. Above him, the many constellations passed in a strange, noiseless circling westward. The moon fell through the last 1,000 fathoms of the night gulf, and only starlight remained. About this time, the buzzing in the corner ceased. The clock had run down. A few minutes passed, and the eastern sky lightened. A gray, sullen morning spread through all the darkness, hiding the march of the stars. Overhead moved a vast seamless sky of gray clouds with heavy, everlasting rolling, a cloud sky that would have seemed motionless through an ordinary Earth day. The sun was hidden, but from moment to moment the world brightened and darkened beneath waves of subtle light and shadow. The light shifted ever westward, and night fell upon the earth. A vast rain seemed to come with it, and a wind of extraordinary loudness as though the howling of a night-long gale were packed into no more than a minute. This noise passed almost immediately. The clouds broke, and once more he could see the sky. The stars were flying westward with astounding speed. For the first time he realized that though the wind's noise had passed, a constant blurred sound remained in his ears. Now that he noticed it, he knew it had been with him all along the world noise. Then came the eastward light. No more than a few heartbeats and the sun rose swiftly. Through the trees he saw it. Then above the trees. Up, up it soared, and all the world was light. It passed with swift, steady swing to its highest altitude and fell westward. He saw the day roll visibly over his head. A few light clouds flittered northward and vanished. The sun went down with one swift, clear plunge, and for a few seconds there was only the darker growing gray of gloaming. Southward and westward the moon was sinking rapidly. The night had already come. A minute, it seemed, and the moon fell those remaining fathoms of dark sky. Another minute or so, and the eastern sky glowed with coming dawn. The sun leapt upon him with frightening abruptness and soared ever more swiftly toward the zenith. Then a fresh thing appeared. A black thundercloud rushed up from the south and seemed to leap the entire arc of the sky in a single instant. Its advancing edge flapped like a monstrous black cloth, twirling and undulating rapidly with horrid suggestiveness. In an instant, the air was full of rain, and 100 lightning flashes seemed to flood downward in one great shower. In the same second the world noise drowned in the roar of wind, and his ears ached under the stunning impact of thunder. In the midst of this storm night came, and within another minute the storm had passed, leaving only the constant blur of world noise in his hearing. Overhead the stars slid quickly westward, and something about their speed brought home to him for the first time a keen realization that it was the world that revolved. He seemed to see the world suddenly, a vast dark mass revolving visibly against the stars. Dawn and sun seemed to come together, so greatly had the world's speed increased. The sun drove up in one long steady curve, passed its highest point, swept down into the western sky, and disappeared. He was scarcely conscious of evening, so brief it was. Then he watched the flying constellations and the westward hastening moon. In seconds, it seemed, the moon slid downward through the night blue, and was gone. Almost directly came morning. Now, a strange acceleration began. The sun made one clear sweep through the sky, vanished behind the western horizon, and night came and went with like haste. As each succeeding day opened and closed, he was aware of a sudden sweat of snow upon the earth. Night came, almost immediately day, and in the brief leap of the sun he saw the snow vanish. Then once more, night. Even after all the incredible things he'd seen, he experienced profound awe throughout. To see the sun rise and set in seconds, to watch the moon leap, a pale, ever-growing orb, into the night sky, and glide swiftly through the vast blue arc, to see the sun follow, springing from the eastern sky as though in chase. Then again night, with the swift ghostly passing of starry constellations. It was all too much to view believingly, yet so it was. Day slipping from dawn to dusk, night sliding swiftly into day, ever more rapidly. The last 3 passages of the sun had shown a snow-covered earth, weird under the fast-shifting light of the soaring and falling moon. Now the sky was hidden briefly by a sea of swaying leaden white clouds that lightened and blackened alternately with the passage of day and night. The clouds rippled and vanished, and once more before him was the vision of the swiftly leaping sun and nights that came and went like shadows. Faster and faster the world spun. Each day and night was completed in seconds, and still the speed increased. A little later he noticed the sun had begun to show a trail of fire behind it, evidently from the speed at which it traversed the heavens. As the day sped ever quicker, the sun began to assume the appearance of a vast flaming comet, flaring across the sky at short intervals. At night, the moon presented an even more comet-like aspect, a pale, swift shape of fire trailing cold flame. The stars showed now merely as fine hairs of fire against the dark. He turned from the window once and glanced at Pepper. In the flash of a day he saw the dog sleeping quietly, and returned to his watching. The sun burst up from the eastern horizon like a stupendous rocket, taking no more than a second or two to hurl from east to west. He could no longer perceive clouds passing across the darkened sky. The brief nights had lost their proper darkness, so the hair-like fire of the flying stars showed dimly. As speed increased, the sun began to sway slowly in the sky from south to north, then slowly from north to south. So amid strange confusion of mind the hours passed. All this while Pepper had slept. Feeling lonely and distraught, he called softly to the dog but got no response. He called again, raising his voice. Still Pepper didn't move. He walked over and touched the dog with his foot to rouse him. At that gentle action, Pepper fell to pieces. He literally and actually crumbled into a moldering heap of bones and dust. For perhaps a minute he stared down at the shapeless heap that had once been Pepper, feeling stunned. What could have happened? He asked himself, not at first grasping the grim significance of that little hill of ash. Then, as he stirred it with his foot, he realized this could only happen over a great space of time, years and years. Outside, the weaving, fluttering light held the world. Inside, he stood trying to understand what it meant, that little pile of dust and dry bones on the carpet. But he couldn't think coherently. He glanced around the room and now, for the first time, noticed how dusty and old the place looked. Dust and dirt everywhere, piled in little heaps in the corners and spread across the furniture. The carpet itself was invisible beneath a coating of the same all-pervading material. As he walked, little clouds rose from under his footsteps, assailing his nostrils with a dry, bitter odor that made him wheeze. His glance fell again on Pepper's remains, and he stood still, voicing his confusion aloud, questioning whether the years were indeed passing, whether this he'd taken for a vision was in truth a reality. A new thought struck him, quickly, but with steps he now noticed tottered. He crossed to the great pier glass and looked in. Too covered with grime to give any reflection, he rubbed the dirt away with trembling hands. Presently he could see himself. His suspicion was confirmed. Instead of the hale man who scarcely looked 50, he saw a bent, decrepit figure, shoulders stooped, face wrinkled with a century's years. The hair that had been nearly coal-black a few hours ago was now silvery white. Only the eyes remained bright. He traced in that ancient face a faint resemblance to himself of other days. He turned away and tottered to the window. He knew now that he was old, and the knowledge seemed to confirm his trembling walk. For a little space, he stared moodily out at the blurred vista of changeful landscape. Even in that short time a year passed, and with a petulant gesture he left the window, noticing his hand shook with the palsy of old age, a short sob choking through his lips. For a while he paced tremulously between window and table, his gaze wandering uneasily. How dilapidated the room was! Everywhere lay thick dust, thick, sleepy, black. The fender was a shape of rust. The chains holding the brass clock weights had rusted through long ago. The weights lay on the floor beneath, 2 cones of verdigris. As he glanced about, it seemed he could see the very furniture rotting before his eyes. Nor was this fancy all at once. The bookshelf along the side wall collapsed with a cracking and rending of rotten wood, precipitating its contents and filling the room with a smother of dusty atoms. How tired he felt. As he walked, it seemed he could hear his dry joints creak and crack at every step. He wondered about his sister. Was she dead as well? All had happened so quickly and suddenly. This must be the beginning of the end of all things. He thought of going to look for her, but felt too weary. And she had been so queer about these happenings of late. Of late! He repeated the words and laughed feebly, mirthlessly, as the realization came that he spoke of a time half a century gone. Half a century! It might have been twice as long. He moved slowly to the window and looked out once more across the world. He could best describe the passage of day and night at this period as a sort of gigantic, ponderous flicker. Moment by moment the acceleration continued, so that at nights he saw the moon only as a swaying trail of palish fire, varying from a mere line of light to a nebulous path, then dwindling and disappearing periodically. The flicker quickened. Days had grown perceptibly darker, a queer quality of dusk in the atmosphere. Nights were so much lighter that stars were scarcely visible, save for occasional hair-like lines of fire swaying with the moon. Quicker and quicker ran the flicker, until suddenly the flicker died out, replaced by a comparatively steady light shed upon the world from an eternal river of flame swinging north and south in stupendous mighty sweeps. The sky had grown much darker, with a heavy gloom in its blue as though a vast blackness peered through upon the earth. Yet there was also a strange, awful clearness and emptiness. Periodically, he glimpsed a ghostly track of fire swaying thin and darkly toward the sun-stream, vanishing and reappearing the scarcely visible moon-stream. Looking at the landscape, he was conscious of a blurring flitter, whether from the ponderous swinging sun-stream's light or the incredibly rapid changes of the earth's surface. Every few moments snow would lie suddenly upon the world and vanish, as abruptly, as though an invisible giant flitted a white sheet off and on. Time fled, and his weariness grew insupportable. He turned from the window and walked once across the room, the heavy dust deadening his footsteps. Each step seemed greater effort than the last. An intolerable ache knew him in every joint and limb as he trod with weary uncertainty. By the opposite wall he came to a weak pause, wondering dimly what his intent was. He looked left, and saw his old chair. The thought of sitting brought faint comfort, yet he was so weary and old, he could barely brace himself to do anything but stand and wish himself past those few yards. He rocked as he stood. The floor seemed a place for rest, but the dust lay so thick and sleepy and black. He turned with great effort and made toward the chair, reaching it with a groan of thankfulness, and sat down. Everything appeared to grow dim. Last night he'd been a comparatively strong though elderly man, and now only a few hours later, he looked at the little dust heap that had once been Pepper. Hours! He laughed, a feeble, bitter laugh, a shrill, cackling laugh that shocked his dimming senses. He must have dozed for a while. Then he opened his eyes with a start. Somewhere across the room, something had fallen with a muffled noise. He looked, and saw vaguely a cloud of dust hovering above a pile of debris. Nearer the door something else tumbled with a crash, one of the cupboards, but he was tired, and took little notice. He closed his eyes and sat in drowsy semi-unconsciousness. Once or twice, as though through thick mists, he heard noises faintly. Then he slept. He awoke with a start, momentarily wondering where he was. Then memory returned. The room was still lit with that strange half-sun, half-moonlight. He felt refreshed, the weary ache gone. He went slowly to the window and looked out. Overhead, the river of flame drove up and down in a dancing semicircle of fire. So vastly had time's passage accelerated, that there was no longer any sense of the sun passing east to west, only the north-south beat of the sun stream, now so swift it was better described as a quiver. As he peered out, a sudden inconsequent memory came of that last journey among the outer worlds, the vision of fast whirling planets about the sun, as though time's governing quality had been held in abeyance and the machine of a universe allowed to run down an eternity in moments. The memory passed along with a partially comprehended suggestion that he'd been permitted a glimpse into further time spaces. He stared again at the quake of the sun. Stream the speed seemed to increase even as he looked. Several lifetimes came and went as he watched. Suddenly it struck him with grotesque seriousness that he was still alive. He thought of Pepper, and wondered how he hadn't followed the dog's fate. Pepper had reached his time and passed, probably through sheer length of years. And here he was, alive, hundreds of thousands of centuries after his rightful period. He mused absently. Yesterday? Then stopped. Yesterday. The yesterday he spoke of had been swallowed in the abyss of ages gone. He grew dazed with much thinking. He turned from the window and glanced around the room. It seemed strangely, utterly different. Then he realized it was bare. Not a piece of furniture, not even a solitary fitting. Gradually his amazement faded, as he remembered this was the inevitable end of the decay process he'd witnessed, beginning before his sleep. Thousands of years, millions of years. Over the floor spread a deep layer of dust reaching halfway up to the window seat, grown immeasurably while he slept, the dust of untold ages. Atoms of the old decayed furniture helped swell its bulk, and somewhere among it all mouldered the long-ago dead Pepper. He realized, with a sudden jolt, that he had no memory of wading through the knee-high dust after waking. True, an unthinkable gulf of years had passed since he'd first approached the window, but that interval, he now understood, was a mere blink compared to the vast ages that must have swallowed him during his sleep. He recalled falling asleep in his old chair. Where had it gone? He looked toward where it had stood. Nothing remained. He couldn't decide if it had crumbled before or after he woke. If it had rotted away beneath him, surely the collapse would have roused him. But the dust lay so thick across the floor, he reasoned, that it would have cushioned his fall. He might have lain there, sleeping for 1,000,000 years or more. His gaze drifted back to that empty spot, and this time he noticed something he'd missed. There were no footprints in the dust between the window and the chair. But then, tens of thousands of years had passed since he'd awakened. His eyes settled on the place where the chair had stood, and suddenly his idle curiosity sharpened into something colder. There, in the dust, he made out a long, rounded shape, softened and blurred by the layers of grime. He could trace the curve of it, the outline of something human, a body, ages dead, lying beneath where he had slept, turned away from him. He tried to puzzle out how it had come to be there. Then a sickening thought crept in. It lay exactly where he must have fallen when the chair gave way. The realization grew, horrifying and inescapable, that dust-shrouded shape was his own dead shell. He knew it with absolute certainty, and wondered why he hadn't seen it from the start. He was no longer a man. He was something bodiless, adrift. He stood for a long while, struggling to steady his thoughts against the weight of this new understanding. Gradually, over what might have been thousands of years, he found a fragile calm, enough to take in his surroundings. The long mound in the dust had sunk, collapsed, and leveled with the rest of the floor, fresh atoms settling over the grave powder ground by the ages. He turned from the window and began to examine the room with fresh eyes. For the first time, he noticed that even this strange old house, which had somehow endured when all else had crumbled, was beginning to decay. He hadn't considered it before, as though he'd assumed it would stand forever. But now he realized that the span it had already survived would have ground any ordinary stone to powder. The plaster was long gone, the woodwork had vanished ages ago. As he watched, a piece of glass from one of the diamond panes fell with a soft tap on the sill and crumbled to dust. Between two of the wall's stones he could see daylight. The mortar was giving way. He turned back to the window and looked out. Time had accelerated to an impossible speed. The sun stream's lateral quiver had become so rapid that the dancing arc of flame had merged into a vast sheet of fire, covering half the southern sky. He glanced down at the gardens, just a blur of pale, dirty green. They seemed higher than before, closer to his window, as though the ground had risen. But they still lay far below, for the arch of rock over the pit held the house at a great height. Over ages, that pale green faded to grayish-white, then to a dead, featureless white. He understood then that snow now covered the entire northern world. Millions of years rolled on toward the end, an end he had once contemplated only in vague, speculative terms, but which now approached in a manner no one could have imagined. A morbid curiosity stirred in him. What would happen when it came? Yet he felt strangely devoid of speculation. All the while decay continued. Glass had vanished, fragments of stone fell with soft thuds and small clouds of dust. He looked up at the fiery sheet above. It had grown duller, deeper in hue. He glanced from the white blur of the world below to the fading flame above, sometimes turning to peer into the growing dusk of the silent room with its carpet of eon-old dust. He watched through the fleeting ages, worn by thoughts and wonderings, a new weariness settling over him. Perhaps 1,000,000 years later, he saw it clearly. The fire that lit the world was darkening. Another vast space passed, and the whole enormous flame had sunk to a deep copper. It darkened further to copper red, then to a heavy purplish tint shot through with the looms of blood. The sun was dying. There was no doubt left. And still the earth whirled onward through space and all the ages. A sense of bewilderment took hold. He found himself wandering mentally between fragmentary modern theories and the old biblical story of the world's end. Then he remembered that the sun and its planets had been hurtling through space at incredible speed. Where were they going? He pondered it for a great while, then let the question go, turning to other thoughts. How much longer would the house stand? Would he be doomed to stay bodiless through the coming dark? From there he drifted back to speculations about the sun's journey through the void, and so another great age passed. The cold crept into him as the ages slipped past, a great winter settling over everything. He remembered then, with the sun dying, the cold would be unimaginably intense. Slowly, across the abyss of time, the earth sank into a heavier, redder gloom. The dull flame in the sky deepened to a somber, turbid hue. Then he noticed a change. The fiery curtain overhead began to thin and contract, and within it he could see the sun stream quivering north and south, like the vibration of a plucked string. The sheet of fire dissolved, and he watched the slowing beat of the sun swing, still inconceivably swift, but growing visibly more deliberate. The fiery arc dimmed steadily beneath it. The world loomed like a ghostly, indistinct region. The river of flame swayed slower, in ponderous beats that stretched into seconds, then nearly a minute each. After a great while, he could no longer see the movement at all. The fire ran as a steady, dull stream across the deadly sky. The arc grew less defined, more attenuated, with occasional blackish streaks. The smooth flow ceased. He perceived a regular, momentary darkening of the world, which lengthened until night descended in short, periodic intervals. The nights and days equaled each other, then shrank to seconds in length. The sun reappeared, as an almost invisible coppery red ball within the glowing mist of its flight, and great dark belts became visible on its half-seen surface. Years flashed by, days and nights stretched into minutes. The sun's tail vanished, and it rose and set, as a tremendous globe of glowing copper bronze, ringed with blood-red and dusky bands of varying thickness. He puzzled over these markings until it occurred to him that the sun wouldn't cool evenly. The red areas were still hot, the black already cool. The belt-like appearance, he reasoned, came from isolated patches spread into rings by the sun's enormous rotation. The sun itself was far larger than in the old days, which meant it was considerably nearer. At night, the moon still showed, but small and remote, its reflected light so dull, it seemed only a dim ghost of the moon he'd once known. Days and nights lengthened, until they equaled something less than an old Earth hour. The sun rose and set like a ruddy bronze disk, crossed with ink-black bars. Now he could see the gardens clearly again, except they were no longer gardens. He looked out on a vast, featureless plain stretching into distance, with low hills to his left, all covered in a uniform white. The snowfall had been immense in places. It rose into hummocks and ridges, though the hills to his left showed bare, dark sides in several places. An incredible death silence and desolation reigned everywhere, the immutable quiet of a dying world. Days and nights continued lengthening, each day perhaps 2 hours from dawn to dusk. At night, he was surprised to find very few stars, small but extraordinarily bright against the peculiar blackness. To the north, he discerned a nebulous mistiness, like a fragment of the Milky Way. It might have been a remote star cluster, or perhaps it was the sidereal universe he had known, now left far behind forever, a dimly glowing mist in the depths of space. The days and nights lengthened slowly. Each sunrise was duller than the last, and the dark belts grew broader. Then something new happened. The sun, earth, and sky were suddenly blotted out for a brief space. He felt, rather than saw, that the earth was enduring a great snowfall. Then the veil vanished, and he looked out on a marvel. The hollow where the house and garden stood was brimmed with snow, lipping over his window-sill. A great level stretch of white reflected the somber coppery glows of the dying sun. The world was a shadowless plain from horizon to horizon. He looked up at the sun. It shone with an extraordinary dull clarity, as though he'd been seeing it through a partial veil until now. All around it the sky had become black, a deep, near, frightful blackness that shook him with its unfriendliness. It was so close. If he were a child, he might have said the sky had lost its roof. He turned to peer into the room. Everywhere was covered with a thin shroud of white, clinging to the ruined walls. The knee-deep dust of centuries was invisible beneath it. Snow must have blown in through the open window frames, yet it lay smooth and level, never drifted. There had been no wind for thousands of years, but the snow was there, and all the earth was silent, and cold beyond any living man's experience. The earth was illuminated by day with a doleful light, as though he looked at the great plain through a bronze-tinted sea. The planet's rotation was steadily departing. The end came all at once. The night had been the longest yet. When the dying sun finally appeared above the world's edge, he greeted it like a friend, so weary had he grown of the dark. It rose steadily to about 20 degrees above the horizon, then stopped. After a strange retrograde movement, it hung motionless, a great shield in the sky. Only the circular rim remained bright, and one thin streak of light near the equator. Gradually, even that thread died out. All that was left of the great and glorious sun was a vast dead disk, rimmed with a thin circle of bronze-red light. The world lay under a savage gloom, cold and unbearable. Outside, an absolute quiet reigned, a silence so complete it pressed against him. From the dark room behind him came the occasional soft thud of falling stone fragments, pieces of rotting masonry giving way. Time passed, and night swallowed the world entirely, wrapping it in impenetrable blackness. There was no night sky as he had known it. Even the few straggling stars had vanished. He might as well have been inside a shuttered room without a single light. Only opposite, in the formless gloom, burned that vast encircling hair of dull fire, and far to the north, that soft mist-like glow still shone. Years moved on in silence. How long he waited he would never know. Eternities came and went stealthily, and still he watched. He could see only the glow of the sun's edge at times, for it had begun to flicker, lighting up for a while, then extinguishing again. Then during one of these brief periods of life, a sudden flame cut across the night, a quick glare that lit up the dead earth for a moment, giving him a glimpse of its flat lonesomeness. The light shot from somewhere near the sun's center, diagonally. He stared, startled. Then the leaping flame sank, and gloom fell again. But now, It was not so dark. The sun was belted by a thin line of vivid white light. He considered whether a volcano had broken out on the sun, but dismissed the thought. The light had been far too intensely white and massive for that. Another idea came. One of the inner planets had fallen into the sun, becoming incandescent under the impact. That seemed more plausible, accounting for the extraordinary size and brilliance of the blaze. He stared across the darkness at that line of white fire, full of interest and emotion. One thing it told him unmistakably: the sun was still rotating at enormous speed. The years were still fleeting at an incalculable rate, though for the earth, life and light and time were things of ages long gone. After that burst, the light showed only as an encircling band of bright fire. He watched it slowly sink to a ruddy tint, then darken to copper red, much as the sun had done. Presently it sank to a deeper hue and began to fluctuate, glowing and dying in turns until, after a great while, it disappeared entirely. Long before that, the smoldering edge of the sun had deadened into blackness, and so, in that supremely future time, the world rode on its gloomy orbit around the ponderous mass of the dead sun. His thoughts at this period were nearly indescribable, chaotic at first, lacking coherence, but as the ages came and went, his soul seemed to absorb the very essence of the oppressive solitude and dreariness that held the earth. With that feeling came a wonderful clarity of thought, and he realized with despair that the world might wander forever through that enormous night. For a while the idea overwhelmed him, filling him with desolation enough to make him weep like a child. But in time the feeling lessened, and an unreasoning hope possessed him. He waited patiently. From time to time, the dull noise of falling particles came from the room behind him. Once he heard a loud crash, and turned instinctively to look, forgetting for the moment the impenetrable night that submerged every detail. His gaze sought the heavens, turning unconsciously toward the north. Yes, the nebulous glow still showed. If anything, it seemed plainer. He fixed his eyes on it for a long time, feeling in his lonely soul that its soft haze was somehow at tie with the past. Strange, the trifles from which one could draw comfort. He watched for a very long space, without any desire for sleep, though he would have welcomed it, if only to escape his perplexities and thoughts. Several times, the comfortless sound of great pieces of masonry falling disturbed his meditations. Once, he thought he heard whispering in the room behind him, but it was useless to try to see anything. The blackness was palpable, hideously brutal, like something dead pressing against him, soft and icily cold. Under all this, a great and overwhelming uneasiness grew in his mind, leaving him only to drop him into uncomfortable brooding. He fought against it, and hoping to distract himself, turned to the window and looked northward in search of that nebulous whiteness, which he still believed to be the far misty glow of the universe they had left. As his eyes rose, he was thrilled with wonder. The hazy light had resolved into a single great star of vivid green. Astonished, he realized the earth must be traveling toward the star, not away, as he had imagined, and it couldn't be the universe they'd left, possibly an outlying star from some vast cluster hidden in the depths of space. He watched with awe and curiosity, wondering what new thing would be revealed. For a while, vague thoughts and speculations occupied him, his gaze fixed insatiably on that one spot of light in the otherwise pit-like darkness. Hope grew within him, banishing the oppressive despair that had seemed to stifle him. Wherever the earth was traveling, at least it was moving toward realms of light again. One had to spend an eternity wrapped in soundless night to understand the full horror of being without it. Slowly but surely, the star grew on his vision, until it shone as brightly as Jupiter had in the old days. With increased size, its color became more striking, like a huge emerald's scintillating rays of fire across the world. Years fled away in silence, and the green star grew into a great splash of flame in the sky. Then he saw something that filled him with amazement, the ghostly outline of a vast crescent in the night, a gigantic new moon growing out of the surrounding gloom. Utterly bemused, he stared at it. It appeared comparatively close, and he puzzled over how the earth had come so near without his seeing it before. The star's light grew stronger, and he realized he could see the earthscape again, though indistinctly. He stared, trying to make out details of the world's surface, but found the light insufficient. He gave up and glanced back at the star. Even in the short time his attention had been diverted, it had increased considerably, now about a quarter the size of the full moon to his bewildered sight. Its light was extraordinarily powerful, but its color so unfamiliar that the world showed unreal, more like a landscape of shadow than anything else. The great crescent brightened steadily, taking on a perceptible green shade. The star swelled until it showed fully half the size of a full moon, and as it grew, the vast crescent threw out more and more light of an ever-deepening green. Under the combined blaze, the wilderness before him became steadily more visible. He seemed able to stare across the whole world, which now appeared terrible in its cold, awful, flat dreariness beneath that strange light. Then he noticed the great star of green flame slowly sinking out of the north toward the east. He could scarcely believe it at first, but soon there was no doubt. As it sank, the vast crescent dwindled to a mere arc against the livid sky, then vanished entirely, disappearing in the same spot from which he'd seen it emerge. The star had come within 30 degrees of the hidden horizon, now rivaling the full moon in size, yet he still couldn't distinguish its disk, which meant it was still extraordinarily distant, and therefore unimaginably huge. Suddenly, the star's lower edge vanished, cut by a straight dark line. A minute or a century passed, and it dipped lower until half had disappeared. Far out on the plain, he saw a monstrous shadow blotting it out and advancing swiftly. Only a third remained visible. Then the solution flashed upon him. The star was sinking behind the dead sun, or rather, the sun, obedient to the star's attraction, was rising toward it, with the earth following in its trail. The star vanished entirely, hidden by the tremendous bulk of the sun, and brooding night fell over the earth once more. With the darkness came an intolerable loneliness and dread. For the first time, he thought of the pit and its inmates, then of the still more terrible thing that had haunted the shores of the Sea of Sleep and lurked in the shadows of the old building. Where were they? He wondered, shivering with miserable thoughts. Fear held him, and he prayed wildly and incoherently for some ray of light to dispel the cold blackness enveloping the world. How long he waited he couldn't say, certainly a very great period. Then a loom of light shone out ahead, becoming more distinct. A ray of vivid green flashed across the darkness. A thin line of livid flame appeared far in the night. In an instant, it had grown into a great cloud of fire, and the world lay bathed in emerald green light. It grew until the whole green star had come into sight again. But now it could scarcely be called a star, having increased to vast proportions, incomparably greater than the sun had been in the olden times. As he stared, he became aware he could see the edge of the lifeless sun, glowing like a great crescent moon. Its lighted surface broadened until half its diameter was visible, and the star began to drop away on his right. The earth moved on, slowly traversing the tremendous face of the dead sun. As the earth traveled forward, the star fell further to the right until it shone on the back of the house, sending broken rays through the skeleton-like walls. He glanced up and saw that much of the ceiling had vanished. The upper stories were even more decayed. The roof was gone entirely, and the green effulgence of starlight shone inslantingly. From the abutment where the windows had once been, he could see that the sun was hugely greater than when the star first lit the world, so great that its lower edge seemed almost to touch the far horizon, and the green radiance grew steadily brighter. For a long space, things remained thus. Then suddenly the sun changed shape and grew smaller, like the moon waning. Soon only a third of the illuminated part faced the earth. The star bore away on the left. Gradually, as the world moved on, the star shone on the front of the house again, while the sun showed only as a great bow of green fire. In an instant, the sun vanished. The star was still fully visible. Then the earth moved into the black shadow of the sun, and all was night black, starless, intolerable. Filled with tumultuous thoughts, he watched across the night, waiting. Years may have passed. Then, in the dark house behind him, the clotted stillness broke. He seemed to hear soft padding of many feet. A faint, inarticulate whisper grew on his senses. He looked around into the blackness, and saw a multitude of eyes. As he stared, they increased, and appeared to come toward him. For an instant he stood frozen. Then a hideous swine noise rose into the night, and he leapt from the window out onto the frozen world. He had a confused notion of running a while, and after that, he simply waited. Several times he heard shrieks, always as though from a distance. Except for those sounds, he had no idea where the house was. Time moved onward. He was conscious of little save cold, hopelessness, and fear. An age seemed to pass, and a glow came that told of approaching light. It grew tardily then. With a loom of unearthly glory, the first ray from the green star struck over the edge of the dark sun and lit the world. It fell upon a great ruined structure some 200 yards away, the house. Staring, he saw a fearsome sight. Over its walls crawled a legion of unholy things, almost covering the old building from tottering towers to base. He could see them plainly, the swine creatures. The world moved out into the star's light, and now it seemed to stretch across a quarter of the heavens, its livid glory so tremendous it filled the sky with quivering flames. Then he saw the sun so close that half its diameter lay below the horizon, towering up into the sky like a stupendous dome of emerald fire as the world circled across its face. He glanced toward the house from time to time, but the swine thing seemed unaware of him. Years appeared to pass slowly. The earth had almost reached the center of the sun's disk. The green sun's light shone through the gaps in the molded walls, giving them the appearance of being wrapped in green flames. The swine creatures still crawled about them. Then a loud roar of swine voices rose, and up from the center of the roofless house shot a vast column of blood-red flame. The little twisted towers and turrets flashed into fire, still preserving their twisted crookedness. The beams of the green sun beat upon the house and intermingled with its lurid glows, so that it appeared a blazing furnace of red and green fire. Fascinated, he watched until an overwhelming sense of coming danger drew his attention. He glanced up. The sun was closer, so close it seemed to overhang the world. Then somehow, he was caught up into strange heights, floating like a bubble in the awful effulgence. Far below he saw the earth, the burning house leaping into an ever-growing mountain of flame around it. The ground glowed, and heavy wreaths of yellow smoke ascended. The world seemed to be igniting from that one plague spot of fire. Faintly, he could see the swine things, apparently quite unharmed. Then the ground caved in suddenly, and the house with its load of foul creatures disappeared into the earth's depths, sending a strange blood-colored cloud into the heights. He remembered the hell pit under the house. After a while he looked around. The huge bulk of the sun rose high above him. The distance between it and the earth grew rapidly less. Suddenly, the earth shot forward, traversing the space between it and the sun in a moment. He heard no sound, but out from the sun's face gushed an ever-growing tongue of dazzling flame, a cataract of blinding fire that seemed to leap almost to the distant green sun, shearing through the emerald light. It reached its limit, and sank on the sun glowed a vast splash of burning white, the grave of the earth. The sun was very close to him now. He found himself rising higher until he rode above it in the emptiness. The green sun was so huge, its breath filled all the sky ahead. He looked down and noted that the sun was passing directly beneath him. A year or a century may have passed. He was suspended alone. The sun showed far ahead, a black circular mass against the molten splendor of the great green orb. Near one edge, a lurid glow marked where the earth had fallen. From this, he knew the long-dead sun still revolved, though with great slowness. To his right, he caught at times a faint whitish glow. For a great while he wasn't sure whether it was fancy or not. He stared with fresh wonderings until he knew it was real. It grew brighter, and presently a pale globe of softest white slid out of the green, approaching him, apparently surrounded by a robe of gently glowing clouds. Time passed. He glanced toward the diminishing sun, now only a dark blot on the green sun's face. It grew smaller steadily, rushing toward the superior orb at immense speed. He stared, conscious of extraordinary emotions, realizing it would strike the green sun. It shrank to no bigger than a pea. He looked with his whole soul to witness the final end of their system, that system which had borne the world through so many eons with its multitudinous sorrows and joys. But something crossed his vision, cutting off the spectacle. He never saw what happened to the dead sun, though in light of what came later, he had no reason to doubt it fell into the strange fire of the green sun and perished. Then an extraordinary question rose in his mind, whether this stupendous globe of green fire might be the vast central sun around which their universe and countless others revolved. He felt confused. He thought of the dead sun's probable end, and another suggestion came. Did dead stars make the green sun their grave? The idea struck him not as grotesque, but as both possible and probable. For a while, many thoughts crowded his mind. He could only stare blindly before him, whelmed in doubt, wonder, and sorrowful remembrance. Later, he came out of his bewilderment and looked about dazedly, and saw something so extraordinary he could scarcely believe he wasn't still wrapped in visionary tumult. Out of the raining green had grown a boundless river of softly shimmering globes, each enfolded in a wondrous fleece of pure cloud. They reached above and below to unknown distances, hiding the green sun's shine, and supplying instead a tender glow of light unlike anything he had ever seen. The spheres had a sort of transparency, as though formed of clouded crystal within which burned a gentle, subdued radiance. They moved past him continually, floating at no great speed, as though they had eternity before them. He watched a great while, and could perceive no end to them. At times he seemed to distinguish faces amid the cloudiness strangely indistinct, partly real, and partly formed of the mist through which they showed. He waited passively for a long time, a growing content settling over him. The unutterable loneliness was gone. He felt less alone than he had been for kalpas of years. This contentment increased until he would have been satisfied to float in company with those celestial globules forever. Ages slipped by. He saw the shadowy faces with greater frequency and plainness. Whether this was due to his soul becoming more attuned to its surroundings, he couldn't tell. Probably it was so, but he became steadily more conscious of a new mystery around him, telling him he had penetrated the borderland of some unthought-of region, some subtle, intangible place or form of existence. The enormous stream of luminous spheres continued passing him at an unvarying rate, countless millions, showing no signs of ending or even diminishing. Then, as he was borne silently upon the unbuoying ether, he felt a sudden irresistible forward movement toward one of the passing globes. An instant later he was beside it, then sliding through into the interior without the least resistance. For a short while he could see nothing and waited curiously. All at once a sound broke the inconceivable stillness, like the murmur of a great sea at calm, breathing in its sleep. Gradually, the mist obscuring his sight thinned away, and his vision dwelt once again upon the silent surface of the sea of sleep. He gazed, scarcely believing he saw aright. There was the great globe of pale fire swimming as before, a short distance above the dim horizon. To his left, far across the sea, he discovered a faint line of thin haze, the shore where his love and he had met during those wonderful periods of soul-wandering granted to him in the old earth days. A troubled memory came to him, the formless thing that had haunted the shores of the sea of sleep, the guardian of that silent, echoless place. He remembered these and other details, and knew without doubt that he was looking out upon that same sea. With the assurance, he was filled with overwhelming surprise, joy, and shaken expectancy, conceiving it possible he was about to see his love again. He gazed intently around but could catch no sight of her. For a little he felt hopeless. He prayed fervently, peered anxiously. The sea was so still. Far beneath him he saw the many trails of changeful fire that had drawn his attention before. He vaguely wondered what caused them. He remembered he'd meant to ask his dear one about them and many other matters, but he'd been forced to leave her before half of what he wished to say was said. His thoughts came back with a leap. He was conscious that something had touched him. He turned quickly. It was she. She looked up into his eyes with eager longing. He looked down to her with all his soul. He wanted to hold her, but the glorious purity of her face kept him at a distance. Then out of the winding mist she put her dear arms. Her whisper came to him, soft as the rustle of a passing cloud, a single word of endearment. That was all, but he had heard, and in a moment he held her to him as he prayed, forever. She spoke of many things, and he listened willingly. Would he have done so through all the ages to come? At times he whispered back, and his whispers brought to her spirit face once more an indescribably delicate tint, the bloom of love. Later he spoke more freely to each word she listened and made answer delightfully, so that already he was in paradise. She and he, with nothing but the silent, spacious void to see them, and only the quiet waters of the sea of sleep to hear them. The floating multitude of cloud-enfolded spheres had long since vanished into nothingness. They looked upon the face of the slumberous deeps, alone together. He had her, and greater than this, she had him, eon aged as he was. On this thought and some others, he hoped to exist through the few remaining years that might yet lie between them. How long their souls lay in the arms of joy he couldn't say, but all at once he was waked from happiness by a diminution of the pale and gentle light that lit the sea of sleep. He turned toward the huge white orb, with a premonition of trouble. One side was curving inward, as though a convex black shadow swept across it. Memory stirred. It was thus the darkness had come before their last parting. He turned to his love, questioning. With sudden grief, he noticed how wan and unreal she had grown, even in that brief space. Her voice came from a distance. The touch of her hands was no more than a summer wind's gentle pressure, growing less perceptible. Already half the immense globe was shrouded. Desperation seized him. Was she about to leave him? Would she have to go as before? He questioned her anxiously. Frightenedly she nestled closer and explained in that strange faraway voice that she must leave before the sun of darkness blotted out the light. At this confirmation of his fears, despair overcame him. He could only look voicelessly across the quiet plains of the silent sea. The darkness spread swiftly across the white orb's face, though in reality the time must have been long beyond human comprehension. At last, only a crescent of pale fire lit the dim sea of sleep. All this while she had held him, with so soft a caress he'd scarcely been conscious of it. They waited there together, speechless for very sorrow. In the dimming light her face showed shadowy, blending into the dusky mistiness surrounding them. Then, when only a thin curved line of soft light remained, she released him, pushing him away tenderly. Her voice sounded in his ears, a farewell she could not stay longer, ending in a sob. She seemed to float away from him, and became invisible. Her voice came faintly from the shadows, apparently from a great distance, promising a little while, then died away remotely. In a breath, the sea of sleep darkened into night. Far to his left, he seemed to see a soft glow. For a brief instant it vanished, and in the same moment he was aware he was no longer above the still sea, but once more suspended in infinite space, with the green sun now eclipsed by a vast dark sphere before him. Utterly bewildered, he stared almost unseeingly at the ring of green flames leaping above the dark edge. Even in the chaos of his thoughts, he wondered dully at their extraordinary shapes. A multitude of questions assailed him, but he thought more of her than of the sight before him. Grief and thoughts of the future filled him. Was he doomed to be separated from her always? Even in the old earth days, she had been his only for a little while, then left him, as he thought, forever. Since then he'd seen her but these times upon the sea of sleep. Fierce resentment filled him, and miserable questionings. Why couldn't he have gone with his love? What reason to keep them apart? Why did he have to wait alone while she slumbered through the years on the still bosom of the sea of sleep? His thoughts turned inconsequently to fresh, desperate questionings. Where was it? Where was it? He'd just parted from his love upon its quiet surface, and it had gone utterly. It couldn't be far away, and the white orb he'd seen hidden in the shadow of the sun of darkness. His sight dwelt on the green sun, eclipsed. What had eclipsed it? Was there a vast dead star circling it? Was the central sun, as he'd come to regard it, a double star? The thought came almost unbidden, yet why not? His thoughts went back to the white orb, strange that it should have been, and stopped. An idea came suddenly. The white orb and the green sun, were they one and the same? His imagination wandered backward. He remembered the luminous globe to which he'd been so unaccountably attracted. Curious, he'd forgotten it even momentarily. Where were the others? He reverted to the globe he'd entered, thought for a time, and matters became clearer. By entering that impalpable globule, he had passed at once into some further, until then, invisible dimension. There, the green sun was still visible, but as a stupendous sphere of pale white light, almost as though its ghost showed, and not its material part. He mused on the subject a long time, remembered how on entering the sphere he'd immediately lost all sight of the others. For a still further period he revolved the details in his mind. In a while his thoughts turned to other things. He came more into the present, and began to look about him, seeingly. For the first time he perceived innumerable rays of subtle violet hue, piercing the strange semi-darkness in all directions. They radiated from the fiery rim of the green sun, growing upon his vision, until he saw they were countless, the night filled with them, spreading outward fanwise from the green sun. He concluded he could see them, because the sun's glory was cut off by the eclipse. They reached right out into space, and vanished. Gradually, he became aware that fine points of intensely brilliant light traversed the rays. Many seemed to travel from the green sun into distance. Others came out of the void toward the sun, but one and all kept strictly to the ray in which they traveled. Their speed was inconceivably great. Only when they neared, or left the green sun, could he see them as separate specks of light. Further from the sun, they became thin lines of vivid fire within the violet. The discovery of these rays and moving sparks interested him extraordinarily. To where did they lead in such countless profusion? He thought of the worlds in space, and those sparks messengers. Possibly the idea was fantastic, but he wasn't conscious of its being so. Messengers from the central sun. An idea evolved slowly. Was the green sun the abode of some vast intelligence? The thought was bewildering. Visions of the unnameable rose vaguely. Had he indeed come upon the dwelling place of the eternal? For a time he repelled the thought dumbly. It was too stupendous. Yet, huge vague thoughts had birth within him. He felt suddenly terribly naked, and an awful nearness shook him. And heaven? Was that an illusion? His thoughts came and went erratically, the sea of sleep, and she, heaven. Then he came back with a bound to the present. Somewhere out of the void behind him, an immense dark body rushed, huge and silent, a dead star, hurling onward to the burying place of the stars. It drove between him and the central suns, blotting them from his vision, and plunging him into impenetrable night. An age passed, and he saw the violet rays again. A great while later, eons, it must have been, a circular glow grew in the sky ahead, and he saw the edge of the receding star show darkly against it. He knew it was nearing the central suns. Presently, he saw the bright ring of the green sun show plainly against the night. The star had passed into the shadow of the dead sun. After that he just waited. The strange years went slowly, and ever he watched intently. The thing he had expected came at last suddenly, awfully. A vast flare of dazzling light burst across the dark void, a streaming burst of white flame soaring outward like a gigantic mushroom of fire. For an indefinite while it grew, then ceased as time passed. It began to sink backward slowly. He saw now that it came from a huge glowing spot near the center of the dark sun. Mighty flames still soared outward from it. Yet despite its size, the grave of the star was no more than the shining of Jupiter upon an ocean's face when compared with the inconceivable mass of the dead sun. No words, he reflected, could ever convey the enormous bulk of the two central suns. Years melted into the past centuries, eons. The incandescent star's light sank to a furious red. Later he saw the dark nebula, at first an impalpable cloud away to his right, growing steadily into a clot of blackness. How long he watched was impossible to say. Time as counted no longer existed. It came closer, a shapeless monstrosity of darkness, tremendous, slipping across the night sleepily like a hell fog. Slowly it slid nearer, passing into the void between him and the central suns as though a curtain had been drawn before his vision. A strange tremor of fear took him, and a fresh sense of wonder. The green twilight that had reigned for so many millions of years gave place to impenetrable gloom. Motionless, he peered about him. A century fled, and he detected occasional dull glows of red passing at intervals. Earnestly he gazed, and seemed to see circular masses showing muddily red within the clouded blackness, growing out of the nebulous murk. They became plainer to his accustomed vision, ruddy tinged spheres, similar in size to the luminous globes he'd seen so long before. They floated past continually, and a peculiar uneasiness seized him. A growing repugnance and dread directed against those passing orbs, born of intuitive knowledge rather than any real cause. Some were brighter than others from one of these. A face looked suddenly human in outline, but so tortured with woe he stared aghast. He hadn't thought such sorrow existed. An added pain came on perceiving the eyes that glared so wildly were sightless. He saw it a while longer. Then it passed into the surrounding gloom. After this he saw others, all wearing that look of hopeless sorrow and blind. A long time went by, and he became aware he was nearer the orbs than before. Unease grew, though he feared them less than before. Seeing their sorrowful inhabitants, sympathy had tempered his fear. Later, there was no doubt he was being carried closer to the red spheres, and presently he floated among them. He perceived one bearing down upon him, helpless to move from its path. In a minute, it seemed upon him, and he was submerged in deep red mist. It cleared, and he stared confusedly across the immense breadth of the plain of silence, just as he'd first seen it. He moved forward steadily across its surface. Ahead shone the vast blood-red ring that lit the place. All around spread the extraordinary desolation of stillness that had so impressed him during his previous wanderings across its starkness. Presently, he saw, rising into the ruddy gloom, the distant peaks of the mighty amphitheater of mountains where untold ages before he'd been shown his first glimpse of the terrors underlying many things, and where, vast and silent, watched by 1,000 mute gods, stood the replica of this house of mysteries, the house he'd seen swallowed in hell fire before the earth kissed the sun and vanished forever. Though he could see the crests, it was a great while before their lower portions became visible, possibly due to the strange ruddy haze clinging to the plain's surface. But he saw them at last. In a further space of time, he came so close to the mountains, they seemed to overhang him. The great rift opened before him, and he drifted into it without volition. Later, he came out upon the breadth of the enormous arena. There, at an apparent distance of some 5 miles, stood the house, huge, monstrous, silent, lying at the very center of that stupendous amphitheater. So far as he could see it, it had not altered in any way. It looked as though only yesterday he'd seen it. Around, the grim dark mountains frowned down from their lofty silences. Far to his right, among inaccessible peaks, loomed the enormous bulk of the great beast, God higher, the hideous form of the dread goddess rising through the red gloom thousands of fathoms above him. To the left, he made out the monstrous eyeless thing, gray and inscrutable further off, reclining on its lofty ledge. The livid ghoul shape showed, a splash of sinister color among the dark mountains. Slowly he moved out across the great arena, floating. As he went, he made out the dim forms of many other lurking horrors that peopled those supreme heights. Gradually, he neared the house, his thoughts flashing back across the abyss of years. He remembered the dread specter of the place. A short while passed, and he saw he was being wafted directly toward that enormous mass. A growing sense of numbness robbed him of the fear he would otherwise have felt. He viewed it calmly, much as a man views calamity through the haze of his tobacco smoke. Soon he'd come close enough to distinguish many details. The longer he looked, the more confirmed he was in his long-ago impressions of its entire similitude to the strange house save in its enormous size. He could find nothing unlike. Then amazement filled him. He'd come opposite that part where the outer door leading into the study was situated. There, lying right across the threshold, lay a great length of coping stone, identical save in size and color with the piece he'd dislodged in his fight with the pit creatures. He floated nearer, and his astonishment increased as he noted the door was broken partly from its hinges, precisely in the manner his study door had been forced inward by the swine thing's assaults. The sight started a train of thoughts. He began to trace dimly that the attack on this house might have far deeper significance than he'd hitherto imagined. He remembered how, long ago in the old Earth days, he'd half suspected that this house was in some inexplicable manner connected with that other tremendous structure. Now it began to be borne upon him he'd only vaguely conceived what his suspicion meant. He began to understand with more than human clearness that the attack he'd repelled was connected in some extraordinary manner with an attack upon that strange edifice. With curious inconsequence, his thoughts abruptly left the matter to dwell wonderingly upon the peculiar material of which the house was constructed, a deep green color that fluctuated slightly, glowing and fading much like phosphorus fumes rubbed upon the hand in the dark. He neared the house, his thoughts flashing back across the abyss of years to the dread specter of the place. A short while passed, and he saw he was being wafted directly toward that enormous mass. A growing numbness stole over him, robbing him of the fear he would otherwise have felt. He viewed it calmly, much as a man views calamity through the haze of tobacco smoke. Soon he'd come close enough to distinguish many details. The longer he looked, the more confirmed he was in his long-ago impressions of its entire similitude to his own strange house save in its enormous size. He could find nothing unlike. Then amazement filled him. He'd come opposite the outer door leading into the study. There, lying across the threshold, lay a great length of coping stone, identical save in size and color with the piece he'd dislodged in his fight with the pit creatures. Floating nearer, his astonishment increased as he noted the door was broken partly from its hinges, precisely as his study door had been forced inward by the swine thing's assaults. The sight started a train of thoughts. He began to trace dimly that the attack on this house might have far deeper significance than he'd imagined. He remembered how, long ago, he'd half suspected that his house was in some inexplicable manner connected with that other structure. Now it began to be borne upon him he'd only vaguely conceived what his suspicion meant. He began to understand, with more than human clearness, that the attack he'd repelled was connected in some extraordinary manner with an attack upon that strange edifice. With curious inconsequence, his thoughts left the matter to dwell upon the peculiar material, a deep green that fluctuated slightly, glowing and fading like phosphorus rubbed upon the hand in the dark. His attention was distracted by coming to the great entrance. For the first time he felt afraid. The huge door swung back, and he drifted helplessly between them. Inside was impenetrable blackness. An instant after crossing the threshold, the great doors closed silently, shutting him in that lightless place. For a while, he seemed to hang motionless, suspended in darkness. Then he became conscious he was moving again where he couldn't tell. Suddenly, far beneath him, he seemed to hear a murmurous noise of swine laughter. It sank away, and the succeeding silence appeared clogged with horror. A door opened somewhere ahead. A white haze of light filtered through, and he floated slowly into a strangely familiar room. All at once, a bewildering screaming noise deafened him. A blurred vista of visions flamed before his sight, his senses dazed through an eternal moment. Then his power of seeing returned. The dizzy, hazy feeling passed, and he saw clearly. He was seated in his chair, back in the old study. His glance wandered round the room. For a minute, it had a strange, quivery appearance, unreal and unsubstantial. This disappeared, and he saw nothing was altered. He looked toward the end window. The blind was up. He rose shakily to his feet. A slight noise toward the door caught his attention. For a brief instant it appeared to be closing gently. He stared. He must have been mistaken. It seemed closely shut. With efforts, he made his way to the window and looked out. The sun was just rising, lighting the tangled wilderness of gardens. He stood staring for perhaps a minute, passing his hand confusedly across his forehead. Amid the chaos of his senses, a sudden thought came. He turned quickly and called for Pepper. No answer. He stumbled across the room in quick fear, trying to frame the name, his lips numb. He reached the table and stooped down with a catching at his heart. Pepper had been lying in its shadow, invisible from the window. Now, as he stooped, his breath caught. There was no Pepper. Instead, he reached toward an elongated little heap of gray ash-like dust. He remained half-stooped for some minutes, dazed and stunned. Pepper had truly passed into the land of shadows. Pepper was dead. Even now, weeks after returning from that strange and terrible journey through space and time, he seemed scarcely able to realize it. Sometimes in sleep, he dreamed of the whole fearful happening. When he woke, his thoughts dwelled on it. Were those suns indeed the great central suns around which the whole universe revolved? Who could say? And the bright globules floating forever in the light of the green sun, and the sea of sleep on which they floated, how unbelievable it all was. If not for Pepper, even after all he'd witnessed, he might imagine it a gigantic dream. Then there was that dreadful dark nebula with its multitudes of red spheres moving always within the shadow of the dark sun, wrapped eternally in gloom. And the faces that peered out at him, did such things really exist? The little heap of gray ash still lay on his study floor. He would not have it touched. When calmer, he wondered what became of the outer planets. Perhaps they'd broken loose from the sun's attraction and whirled away into space. This was only surmise. There were so many things to wonder about. Now, writing, he recorded his certainty that something horrible was about to happen. Last night an occurrence had filled him with even greater terror than the pit fear. He felt there was more in this last affair than in all the others. He was shaky and nervous, even as he wrote. Somehow he thought death was not far away. Not that he feared death as understood, but there was something in the air that bade him fear an intangible, cold horror. He'd felt it last night. He'd been sitting in his study writing, the door into the garden half open. At times the metallic rattle of a dog's chain sounded faintly. A new dog he'd bought since Pepper's death. He wouldn't have him in the house, not after Pepper, but felt it better to have a dog about the place. He was engrossed in his work, time passing quickly. Suddenly, he heard a soft noise on the path outside. Pad, a stealthy, curious sound. He sat upright quickly and looked through the open door. The sound came again. Pad, apparently approaching. With slight nervousness he stared into the gardens, but the night hid everything. The dog gave a long howl. He started. He peered intently for a minute, but could hear nothing. After a little he picked up his pen and resumed work, the nervous feeling gone, imagining the sound was just the dog walking around his kennel at the length of his chain. A quarter hour passed. Then the dog howled again with such plaintive sorrow that he jumped to his feet, dropping his pen and inking the page. He muttered at the dog, and even as he spoke, the sound came again. Pad, horribly close, almost by the door. He knew now it couldn't be the dog. The chain wouldn't allow him so near. The dog's growl came again. He noted the taint of fear in it. Outside on the windowsill he saw Tip, his sister's pet cat. As he looked, the cat sprang to its feet, its tail swelling visibly. For an instant it stood thus, seeming to stare fixedly at something toward the door. Then it began backing along the sill until it reached the wall at the end, and could go no further. There it stood rigid, frozen in an attitude of extraordinary terror. Frightened and puzzled, he seized a stick from the corner and moved toward the door silently, taking a candle with him. He'd come within a few paces when a peculiar sense of fear thrilled through him, palpitant and real, with no clear source or reason. The terror was so great, he wasted no time, retreating immediately, walking backward with his gaze fixed fearfully on the door. He would have given much to rush at it, fling it shut, and shoot the bolts. He'd had it repaired and strengthened, so that now it was far stronger than ever. Like Tip, he continued his almost unconscious backward progress until the wall stopped him. He started nervously and glanced around apprehensively. His eyes dwelled momentarily on the rack of firearms, and he took a step toward them, but stopped with a curious feeling they would be needless. Outside in the gardens the dog moaned strangely. Suddenly from the cat came a fierce, long screech. He glanced jerkily in its direction. Something luminous and ghostly encircled it, growing on his vision. It resolved into a glowing hand, transparent, with a lambent greenish flame flickering over it. The cat gave a last awful caterwaul. He saw it smoke and blaze. His breath came in a gasp as he leaned against the wall. Over that part of the window a green fantastic smudge spread, hiding the thing from him, though the glare of fire shone through dully. A stench of burning stole into the room. Pad. Something passed down the garden path, and a faint moldy odor seemed to come through the open door, mingling with the burnt smell. The dog had been silent for a few moments. Now he yowled sharply as though in pain, then quieted save for occasional subdued whimpers of fear. A minute went by. The gate on the west side of the garden slammed distantly. After that, nothing, not even the dog's whine. He must have stood there some minutes. Then a fragment of courage stole into his heart. He made a frightened rush at the door, dashed it shut, and bolted it. After that, for a full half-hour, he sat helpless, staring rigidly before him. Slowly his life came back. He made his way shakily upstairs to bed. That was all. Early the next morning he went through the gardens, finding everything as usual. Near the door he examined the path for footprints, but found nothing to tell him whether he'd dreamed last night. Only when he spoke to the dog did he discover tangible proof that something had happened. When he went to the kennel, the dog stayed inside, crouched in one corner. He had to coax him out. When he finally consented to come, it was in a strangely cowed and subdued manner. As he patted him, his attention was attracted to a greenish patch on the left flank. Examining it, he found the fur and skin had apparently been burnt off. The flesh showed raw and scorched. The mark's shape was curious, reminding him of the imprint of a large talon or hand. He stood up thoughtfully. His gaze wandered toward the study window. The rising sun's rays shimmered on the smoky patch in the lower corner, causing it to fluctuate oddly from green to red. That was undoubtedly another proof. The horrible thing he'd seen last night rose in his mind. He looked at the dog again. He knew the cause of that hateful wound now, and knew that what he'd seen had been real. A great discomfort filled him. Pepper Tip, and now this poor animal. He glanced at the dog again, noticing he was licking his wound. He muttered a pitying word, and bent to pat his head. The dog got to his feet, nosing and licking his hand wistfully. He left him, having other matters to attend. After dinner he visited the dog again. He seemed quiet, disinclined to leave his kennel. His sister reported he'd refused all food that day. She appeared a little puzzled, though quite unsuspicious of anything to fear. The day passed uneventfully. After tea he looked at the dog again, moody, somewhat restless, yet persisting in remaining in his kennel. Before locking up for the night, he moved the kennel out away from the wall so he could watch it from the small window. The thought came to bring him inside, but consideration decided him to let him remain out. The house was in no degree less to be feared than the gardens. Pepper had been in the house, and yet... It was now 2 o'clock. Since 8 he'd watched the kennel from the small side window in his study. Nothing had occurred, and he was too tired to watch longer. He would go to bed. During the night he was restless, unusual for him, but toward morning he obtained a few hours' sleep. He rose early, and after breakfast visited the dog. He was quiet but morose, refusing to leave his kennel. He wished there were a horse doctor nearby. He'd have the poor brute looked at. All day the dog had taken no food, but had shown an evident desire for water, lapping it greedily. He was relieved to observe this. Evening came. He was in his study, intending to follow last night's plan and watch the kennel. The garden door was securely bolted. He was consciously glad there were bars on the windows. Midnight had gone. The dog had been silent so far. Through the side window on his left, he could make out the kennel's dim outline. For the first time, the dog moved. He heard the rattle of his chain. He looked out quickly. As he stared, the dog moved restlessly again, and he saw a small patch of luminous light shine from the kennel's interior. It vanished. The dog stirred again, and once more the gleam came. He was puzzled. The dog quieted, and he could see the luminous thing plainly. There was something familiar about its shape. For a moment he wondered. Then it came to him. It was not unlike the 4 fingers and thumb of a hand. Like a hand, And he remembered the contour of that fearsome wound on the dog's side. It must be the wound he was seeing. It was luminous at night. Why? Minutes passed, his mind filled with this fresh thing. Suddenly, he heard a sound out in the gardens that thrilled through him. It was approaching. Pad, pad, pad. A prickly sensation traversed his spine and seemed to creep across his scalp. The dog moved in his kennel and whimpered frightenedly. He must have turned around, for now he could no longer see the outline of his shining wound. Outside, the gardens fell silent once more, and he listened fearfully. A minute passed, and another. Then the padding sound came again, quite close, coming down the graveled path. The noise was curiously measured and deliberate. It ceased outside the door. He rose to his feet and stood motionless. From the door came a slight sound, the latch being slowly raised. A singing noise filled his ears. He had a sense of pressure about his head. The latch dropped with a sharp click into the catch, startling him afresh, jarring horribly on his tense nerves. After that, he stood a long while amid ever-growing quiet. All at once his knees began to tremble. He had to sit quickly. An uncertain period passed. Gradually, he began to shake off the terror. Yet still he sat, seeming to have lost the power of movement. He was strangely tired, inclined to doze. His eyes opened and closed. He found himself falling asleep and waking in fits and starts. Some time later, he was sleepily aware that one candle was guttering. When he woke again, it had gone out. The room was very dim under the light of the one remaining flame. The semi-darkness troubled him little. He'd lost that awful sense of dread. His only desire seemed to be to sleep. Sleep. He jolted awake from a dead sleep, fully alert in an instant, his senses screaming that something immense and nameless had drawn near. The air itself felt thick with a suffocating dread, pressing in from all sides. He sat motionless in his chair, straining to hear any sound at all, but the world was mute, as though nature had stopped breathing. Then a thin, eerily high wail of wind spiraled around the house and faded into silence, leaving the stillness more oppressive than before. His eyes adjusted to the dim candlelight, sweeping across the familiar shapes of the room. A tall, dark mass loomed beside the great clock in the corner, and his heart seized for a moment before he recognized it as nothing more than a shadow cast by the furniture. Relief flickered through him, short-lived and thin. In the hush that followed, a thought surfaced unbidden. He could simply abandon this place, walk away from the house and all its horrors. But as soon as the notion formed, another image rose in its place. The vast, quiet expanse of the Sea of Sleep, where he had been granted moments with her, the one he had lost and found again across the gulf of years. The memory was enough to settle his resolve. He would remain, no matter what came. His gaze drifted to the side window, with the night pressed black and sightless against the glass, then wandered aimlessly around the room, touching on each shadowed object. He turned his head toward the window on his right, and froze. A colossal misty face, the visage of a pig, loomed just beyond the bars, wreathed in a flickering greenish flame. Its mouth hung open, dripping with phosphorescent slaver, and its eyes stared through the dimness at him with an expression he could not read. He could not move, could not look away. The creature shifted, its massive head rotating slowly to fix him directly in its gaze. Two enormous eyes, disturbingly human yet utterly alien, locked onto his. The cold of absolute terror seized his bones, and yet his mind remained unnervingly clear, noting with a strange detachment that the distant stars were blotted out entirely by the sheer mass of that face. Then a new horror gripped him. Against every conscious wish, he felt himself rising from the chair, his body moving of its own accord toward the garden door. He fought to stop, to press backward, but an invisible force propelled him forward, step by unwilling step. His helpless gaze swept the room and found the window empty, that the swine thing had vanished, but the soft, deliberate padding resumed outside the door, the sound stopping just as he reached the threshold. A short, terrible silence stretched out, and then the latch began to rise with a slow, deliberate rattle. Desperation flared in him. He refused to move another inch, throwing all his will against the unseen pressure. It was like pushing against a wall of solid air. A groan of pure agony escaped his throat, and the sound of his own fear only made it worse. The latch rattled again, and he shivered, clammy with sweat. He struggled with everything he had, but his body continued its relentless march forward, his hand reaching up of its own accord to draw the topmost bolt. The door shook violently as his fingers touched the metal, and a wave of stale, moldy air seeped through the gaps in the wood. He drew the bolt back, every muscle screaming in resistance, and it slid free with a sharp click. His hands trembled as he stood there, arms hanging limp. For a moment, the compulsion seemed to ease. Then a sudden clatter of iron at his feet made him look down in unspeakable horror. His own foot was sliding the lower bolt from its housing, and he was utterly powerless to stop it. The bolt cleared with a ringing scrape, and he staggered, his hands clutching at the central fastening for support. Time stretched into an eternity. His fingers began to work on the last bolt, and he knew he could not allow it to open, that death would be better than facing what waited on the other side. A hoarse scream tore from his lips as the bolt jerked halfway out. His hands, moving without his consent, kept drawing it back, and he screamed again twice in the supreme anguish of his fear. With a final convulsive effort, he wrenched his hands away. Blackness swam before his eyes, his knees buckled, and through a roaring in his ears, he heard a heavy, rapid thudding against the door before consciousness failed him entirely. When awareness returned, he realized he had been lying on the floor for hours. The second candle had burned out, leaving the room in deep shadow, and a terrible cold had seized his limbs, stiffening them with cramps. But his mind was clear now, the alien influence gone. He pushed himself to his knees, fumbled in the dark for the central bolt, and drove it home. Then the lower one, and finally, with effort, he rose to his feet and secured the topmost fastening. Dropping back to his knees, he crawled through the maze of furniture, staying low to avoid the window, until he reached the opposite door and slipped into the passage. A final nervous glance back caught only a faint, shapeless suggestion of something outside in the night, perhaps nothing more than a trick of the darkness, before he climbed the stairs to his bedroom. He collapsed into bed, still fully dressed, pulling the blankets over him for warmth. The attempt to process the night's events proved futile. His thoughts refused to cohere, skittering away into blankness. He tossed through the remaining hours, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, revealing the room's bare, dismal state. It struck him, with a kind of distant surprise, that he had never really noticed before how cheerless this old place was. Below, he heard his sister Mary moving about the kitchen, and he listened at the door for a moment, feeling strangely detached. She seemed so untouched by all the house's horrors, except for the one incident with the pit creatures, almost as if she lived in a different world entirely. He considered their relationship, both of them old, sharing a house but little else, and wondered if it was a lack of common ground or simply the preference for quiet overcompany. The musing served to distract him from the oppressive weight of the previous night. He opened the window and breathed in the cold, crisp morning air, feeling the last vestiges of fear begin to lift. Somewhat reassured, he went down and out into the garden to check on the dog. The same sour, moldy smell that had filtered through the door last night greeted him as he approached the kennel. The animal did not respond to his calls, and even a small stone tossed inside only roused it to uneasy movement. His sister came out and joined him, trying to coax the beast out as well. Eventually the dog emerged, shambling and unsteady, swaying on its feet with a vacant, blinking stupor. The wound on its side had grown alarmingly, a whitish, fungus-like mass spreading across its flesh. When his sister moved to pet it, he stopped her, explaining with a vague excuse that it was wise to keep a distance until they knew what was wrong. She brought out some scraps, which he pushed within reach using a broken branch, but the creature ignored the food and retreated into its kennel. Her confusion was plain, but he knew it would be madness to tell her the truth. The rest of the day passed without incident, and when night fell he resolved to repeat his vigil, though he had taken the precaution of driving nails into the backs of the 3 bolts to prevent any repetition of the previous night's horror. He watched from 10 until nearly 3, but nothing stirred, and at last, exhausted, he stumbled to bed and fell into a deep sleep. He awoke in darkness, his body restless, turning over again and again in a futile search for sleep. A dull ache pressed behind his eyes, and his temperature swung between chills and fever. Finally giving up, he reached out for the matches, intending to light a candle, and read until drowsiness claimed him. His fingers found the box in the dark, but as he opened it, a phosphorescent spark of light caught his attention, glowing there among the shadows. He reached out and touched it. It was on his wrist. Alarm prickled through him as he struck a match, the brief flare revealing nothing more than a tiny scratch. He muttered dismissively, trying to convince himself it was imagination, until the match burned his finger, and he dropped it. As he fumbled for another, the speck of light reappeared, and denial was no longer possible. With the second match, he lit the candle and examined the spot more carefully. A faint greenish discoloration had formed around the scratch, and a sickening realization began to take shape. The memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. The morning after the thing from the arena had come, the dog had licked his hand, this same hand. He had not even been conscious of it at the time. Now the full horror of the connection crashed over him. The dog's wound had shown at night, and now the same luminous corruption was blooming on his own flesh. But dazed, he sat on the edge of the bed, his mind refusing to function, numbed by the sheer weight of this new terror. Hours passed unheeded in the darkness. He tried once to convince himself it was all a mistake, but the certainty in his heart would not be shaken. Morning came and went, and night returned. He had risen at dawn and shot the dog, burying it deep among the bushes. His sister had been frightened by the act, but desperation had driven him. The growth on the animal had nearly consumed its left side, and the patch on his own wrist had grown noticeably larger, spreading. He found himself muttering fragments of childhood prayers, the words escaping unbidden. 6 days passed without food. He sat in his study chair, swathed in constant terror, feeling the burning advance of the corruption across his right arm and side, creeping up toward his neck. Tomorrow, it would reach his face, he knew, and he would become a walking mass of living decay. There was no way out. But then his gaze fell on the gun rack across the room, and a thought took hold, growing with terrible insistence. He reasoned with himself, argued that death was infinitely preferable to what awaited him. There was nothing else left, no hope, no escape, only that final mercy to spare himself the ultimate horror. He must have dozed, weakened, and drained. His hearing had become unnaturally acute, every small sound grating on his nerves. Then, through the silence, he caught something from far below, a creaking noise, unmistakable. The great oak trap in the cellars was opening. Padding steps followed, climbing the stairs, drawing closer. He heard fumbling at the door handle, and his last desperate prayer went up, begging for mercy. The door was opening, slowly, and something was there. He set the manuscript down and looked across at Tonneson, who sat staring into the darkness, lost in thought. After a long pause, he asked the question that had been forming in his mind. Tonneson turned slowly, his gaze distant at first, then gradually focusing. He shook his head when asked if the old recluse had been mad, the certainty in his voice striking a strange chord. The listener felt his own doubts waver, though he was not entirely convinced. Tonneson rose stiffly and began to undress, clearly not inclined to talk, and the other followed suit, though sleep did not come easily. As he settled into his blankets, a memory stirred the old gardens they had seen, and the inexplicable fear that had gripped them there. The conviction grew that Tonneson was right. They woke late the next day, near noon, both feeling out of sorts under a dismal, chilly sky. There was no talk of fishing. After a quiet dinner, they sat smoking in silence until Tonneson requested the manuscript and spent the afternoon reading it through alone. A thought occurred to him about revisiting the place downstream, but Tonneson's abrupt refusal brought more relief than annoyance. Later, near tea-time, his companion looked up and apologized for his earlier shortness, explaining that he would not return there for anything. shuddering as he set the account aside. The next morning they swam and recovered enough to take their rods out, spending the day at the river. They made the most of the remainder of their holiday, though both were eager for the driver's return, hoping to glean some information about the strange garden from the villagers. The driver arrived early one morning while they were still in bed, and they pressed him eagerly about the pit, the lake, and the old house. He recalled only a vague rumor from his youth about a great house alone in the wilderness, something queer about it, perhaps given over to fairies, but little more. Tonneson sent him into the village to learn what he could while they dressed and prepared breakfast. He returned just as they sat down to eat. The driver returned with the villagers still abed, reporting with a grin that they were all lazy and asleep, his eyes wandering hungrily to the provisions laid out on the chest. He was invited to join them for breakfast, an offer he accepted without hesitation. After the meal, Tonneson sent him out again to press for more information while they sat smoking in the tent. Nearly an hour passed before he came back, clearly having uncovered something of interest. He had spoken with one of the village elders, the oldest man in the hamlet, who knew more about the strange house than anyone else alive. The elder's story went back to his own youth, though how many decades that encompassed was impossible to guess. In those days, a great house had stood at the center of the gardens, where only that single fragment of ruin remained. Even then, the building had been empty for many years, long before the old man's birth, shunned by generations of villagers. It was spoken of only in whispers, a byword for everything unholy and dreadful, and no one dared approach it, neither by day nor night. Then one day, a stranger rode through the village and turned down the river toward the house. He passed back through a few hours later and continued on toward Ardrahan. For 3 months nothing was heard, until he returned with an elderly woman and a train of donkeys laden with supplies. They rode straight through without stopping, heading for the house. From that point on, no one ever saw either of them again, except for the carrier they hired to bring monthly provisions from Ardrahan. He never spoke of them to anyone, likely well paid for his silence. The years passed quietly in the little village, with the carrier making his regular journeys without incident, until one day he arrived at the house and returned just hours later, wild with excitement, reporting that the building had vanished entirely, replaced by a vast yawning pit. The news stirred the villagers to overcome their fear and march en masse to the place, where they found everything exactly as the carrier had described. That was all they could learn. The identity of the manuscript's author, where he came from, who he was, all of it would remain buried, just as he seemed to have wished. They left Creighton that same day and never returned. Sometimes, in dreams, he still sees that enormous pit ringed by wild trees and bushes, hears the water's endless roar blending with other, deeper sounds, with the eternal spray hanging like a shroud over everything. The end.